An interview with Gary Kurtz, by Ken P. originally posted at IGN.com on May 20, 2002.
IGN Film First. I'd like to go back to the very beginning and ask about your introduction to the film industry. Gary Kurtz. Well, I went to film school at USC in Los Angeles. Actually, to go back even further than that, I was a music major, really, in high school in the Southern California area and actually went to USC on a music scholarship to begin with. At that time, I was looking to major in composition and conducting with a possibility of maybe teaching music. But, it was a bit vague, and in the first year one of the requirements of music scholarships is that you have to play in every group that's available. So I was playing in the concert band, the symphony orchestra, the opera orchestra, the wind and other small ensembles in the classical music side, as well as the jazz band and a couple of other jazz groups that were organized at the school. Was that just meant to give you versatility as far as that curriculum? Kurtz. Well, that was part of it, and also they always desperately needed members to play in the various groups, and so they felt that music experience and performance. A lot of composition majors didn't know how to play anything but the piano. So one of the important things was to get orchestral experience playing an orchestra instrument other than the piano. I didn't have that problem. I played reeds primarily and then oboe and English horn, and dabbled in most of the rest of the instruments except for the heavy brass. I never tried to play anything other than a bit of the clarinet. In that first year at USC I did the music for 3 or 4 student films. It didn't necessarily mean composing music, because the time deadlines were unbelievably short, so it meant mostly to assemble music from a variety of sources. Since they were student films, it didn't really matter where they came from, there were no rights problems. In doing that, though, I became more and more interested in the films. I had had previous experience in high school at shooting 8mm and 16mm film footage, both documentary and sort of dramatic type materials. So it wasn't a new thing to me. And I had been a keen still photographer for years, so moving to a cinema major wasn't really that big a jump. And this would have been what, the mid-60s? Kurtz. No. I went to USC first in 1959, so it was in the early 60s. Very early 60s. So you were a part of that initial group of classes in the film department? Kurtz. No. The film department at USC had been going on since the 1920s, since the silent days. I guess it was the oldest film school in existence, because it started so early. It wasn't really until the mid-60s, after I'd finished and was gone, that the popularity of studying cinema became magnified 100% or more, because when I was there, it was very difficult to find enough students to make up film crews. As a matter of fact, in the first senior project year that I was in that term, I was doing advanced camera, as well as sound and production management and other things, and I had to work on 4 of the 7 projects. Normally, you're only supposed to work on 1. But everybody in the class that I was in worked on 4 or 5 projects, because there weren't enough people. Then the next term, when I directed, I had a really hard time getting together enough of a crew. I had to actually do a lot of my own camera work, there wasn't a camera person available. Film school wasn't particularly popular at that time. It wasn't until George Lucas and his group, John Milius and those guys, who went to USC also, they didn't start until '66, by then it seemed to be much more popular. And certainly by the end of the '60s. It was incredibly popular, and they had to create all kinds of devices to wheedle out a lot of people by requiring a lot of portfolio work and films made in high school, all kinds of pre-requirements, just to get it down to a usable number of students that they could cope with. During the time you were there, was it rather open? Kurtz. Oh, it was completely open. If you had projects, either written or film projects, they would look at early film projects or just written material, scripts and proposals for projects, for acceptance. But it wasn't too definitive, because they were interested in having enough students to make up the program. And at the time you were going, how respected was the film program by the industry? Kurtz. Oh, it was quite well respected. There were a lot of people that had graduated out of the program in the post-war period, the late 40s, 50s, that had become fixtures in the industry of one kind or another, studio executives or agents or television producers or a few film directors, but it wasn't a straight line to the creative heart, because the other big factor was the fact that the unions in the late 50s and 60s were very strong, and you couldn't work in the industry unless you were a union member, as far as the crafts were concerned, and you couldn't get into the unions because they were closed. A closed shop kind of system. So the experience that I got while I was a film student was working on Roger Corman kind of low-budget exploitation films, and I worked on a lot of those, 40 or 50 over a 3 or 4 year period. Generally doing what type of work? Kurtz. Well, everything really. I started out being a grip and an electrician and a sound boom operator, and on some of the later ones I was the director of photography and film editor or production supervisor. So, basically, a jack of all trades. Kurtz. Yes, a little of everything. On some projects, there was so few crew that they were very much like student films. I remember one picture where I was production manager and the assistant director, as well as the editor and one of the cameramen, and the second unit director as well. Now in film school at that time, what were the aspirations for afterwards? I mean, when you talk to film students now, everyone wants to be a director right out of the gate. Kurtz. Yes, that wasn't quite as strong then. There was a general feeling, in the very early 60s, that people wanted to sort of break down the barriers of Hollywood and go into all of the various things. There were a lot of students who wanted to become editors, and there were a lot who wanted to become cameramen. There were quite a few who wanted to be directors as well, but it didn't seem to be the only thing. It hadn't quite been placed on the pedestal it got placed on later, had it? Kurtz. No. The auteur theory really came out of the French New Wave writings in the late 50s/early 60s, and we were reading all that stuff from Cahiers du Cinéma and talking about it at school, I remember, and I think most of the students thought the concept intellectually was valid, but practically was rubbish because there were so many accidents that happen on a film. The chemistry of the group that you've gotten together makes a huge difference, and yes, picking the right people is important. But it's really difficult for a director, unless you're Stanley Kubrick, to have the final say on every single little minute detail, so all the films are pretty much a group effort. It can be pretty much assumed that most of the aspiring directors felt that way. They had no illusions about the fact that they could become like French directors were. Sometimes having absolute final say is one of the worst things that can happen if you have wrong instincts. Kurtz. Yes, absolutely. I mean, the whole point of having a group effort is that your crew becomes a sounding board. I never understood the auteur theory when so much of a film is a matter of checks and balances. Kurtz. Well, I think that intellectually the auteur theory came out of the idea of looking at a body of work, like Hitchcock's work or Hawks's work or John Ford's work, and trying to see common threads. Well, that's perfectly acceptable as an analysis of the whole career of a filmmaker, because there are going to be tying threads there. A director's not going to pick a project to do unless it has some meaning to them. You are going to find that it's just the idea of the director being the only creative entity on a picture was the aspect that I think most people felt was a bit far-fetched. And do you think that that trend has become detrimental over time? Kurtz. Yes, I do. Definitely. I especially think, since I've focused mostly on my career on producing and working with a lot of first-time directors, I've felt that what's happened is that the working producer's job, basically, of being the director's partner and being his mirror and sounding bound, has disappeared and the producer's job has primarily turned to deal-making. Most of the people whose names you see up on the screen don't have anything to do with the making of the film, which is a shame, really, because it leaves the director kind of totally on his own. And it means also that there's no one to say wait a minute, that's terrible, don't do that. There are no men anymore. Kurtz. There are no men. Yes, exactly. Do you think that leads to the working producer now being more of a traveling man than they were in the past? You used to be able to see that certain directors worked hand in hand with producers over 10 films. Now you'll be lucky if they work past 2 films, if one of those is a success. Kurtz: yes, I think that's a result of most of those relationships having risen out of the deals. Sometimes the producer's relationship with the director and the writer on a project is only because either they own the property in the first place or they're the one that pulled the money together, so that there is no actual working relationship. The legwork that the producer should be doing is shared out amongst the production staff, some of it being done by the production supervisor and others, and the rest being absorbed by the director. I mean, I've never felt that it's fair to a director, in a way, to saddle him with having to deal with all that stuff. I've always felt that a good producer should insulate the director completely from having to deal with the studio and any outside influences, to allow him to get on with working with the actors and putting the film together. Do you think that film schools today, and to a large extent apocryphal evidence that filters down, have made directors nowadays believe that any and all producers should be seen as enemies to whatever the vision of the director may, or may not, be? Kurtz: I'm sure they do, because that's probably the case. The producer is looked upon as pretty much the same as a studio executive, who may not have any idea about the project. Whereas if you go back to the 60s, 70s and even before, even of the big studios days, prior to the studios losing their real power in the 60s, the producers that were working, the Arthur Freeds of the world, and David O. Selniks, they had the power. The directors were their hired hands. That's not necessarily great either. But those kinds of producers from the 30s and 40s seemed to have a fairly grand vision of what they wanted to see on the screen. The directors that they hired went along with them, and that was part of the studio system anyway, when they all were employees of the studio. So it isn't fair to try to compare that with what's going on today. The irony is that a good deal of major directors nowadays have become those type of producers as well, bringing on other directors as hired hands. Kurtz: yes, exactly. Because they had the power to do that. But there are so few good movies made today, it's difficult for me to believe that it's all because the directors don't have any vision in what they want to see. I think it's primarily due to the fact that the studios are now all owned by big conglomerates who are interested in making money to the exclusion of everything else. Now, the studios always wanted to make money, that was one of their reasons for being in existence, but the men who ran the studios, no matter how difficult they were, they had some sense of what being a showman was like. They were willing to take chances on oddball projects, and you don't see that as much anymore. There are smaller companies who will, but there's so many stories about projects floating around the last 10 years that couldn't get made because the elements weren't right. When you just look at the list of the elements that the studios wanted, you know it wouldn't work that way. But it's a security blanket to have it be a Tom Cruise picture, or a Jack Nicholson picture, or whoever. Whether they're right for the project or not, the studio executive is not going to get fired if the picture fails if they have A-list talent. Right, and then they complain about the audience for not accepting it. Kurtz: yes. I'm interested. When you talk about the golden age of Hollywood, as opposed to now, there seems to be a better balance between okay, these are our A pictures, and then these are our B pictures, the experimental ones that we'll toss money towards, but we're going to bank on the A ones. If the B ones hit, fine. Now it seems that everything has to be a blockbuster. Kurtz: yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I was part of the program at Universal Studios in the early 70s, the low-budget program that was run by Ned Tannen, which produced 12 or 13 pictures, all under $1 million at that time. Anything under $1 million was considered bare-bones movies. The most famous film that came out of the group was, of course, American Graffiti. And it made the most money, but all the films that were made under that program were interesting, quirky films that at least made their money back. If you count video and things over the long run, they all made money. It's not Jaws business, but American Graffiti even wasn't Jaws business. American Graffiti was a very, very small picture that went on to do reasonably well. I think it eventually did $60 million in America, which wasn't big box office even in the early 70s. But, Based on the cost of the picture, it was pretty phenomenal. The other pictures in that program, Doug Trumbull's Silent Running and John Cassavetes' Minnie and Moskowitz and Milos Forman's Taking Off and Peter Fonda's The Hired Hand, and the other one that I helped produce, Monty Hellman's Two-Lane Blacktop, all of those films are interesting films and they're worth seeing today. They hold up very well. Kurtz, they do hold up very well, and because they cost so little money, the studio didn't worry about them. But no one seems to be willing to experiment with a program like that today, at all. They're not willing to make small films, or if they do, they make them they don't make them, actually. They have a classics division of some kind or another like Fox Searchlight or Miramax that seek out odd projects, and they get made independently and then just released by the studio. The studio doesn't instigate the making of those projects. So they have no initial costs. Kurtz, no, they do have costs. They wait for the filmmakers to come to them with a developed script. Or, in some cases, a completely filmed project. Kurtz, well, yes, that happens, too. It seems like the industry depends solely upon initiative, nowadays, rather than taking any risks. Kurtz, at the time we were doing American Graffiti at Universal, which was not a picture made on the lot, although we had an office there, it was made in San Francisco, and we were very rarely at the studio. But some of the times when I was at the studio for meetings and various things, I realized in talking to some of the story department people that they had probably 100 projects in various stages of development, script development, that they were paying someone to develop. They don't do much of that anymore at all. I suppose the idea is now that the script will somehow be generated. Either the independent producers or the writers themselves will spend the time and energy to develop them to the point where they can be seen. I think one of the reasons that there are so few good movies is that process has been truncated so much. Too many films go into production before they're ready. With the belief that it can be fixed on set? Kurtz, well, yes, I'm sure that some people would say that, but I think that they're looking at them as some sort of cannon fodder, really. They don't really care. If everybody gets their fees and they make enough money to pay the mortgage, then that's the end of it. There's not much passion involved in the concept of the film. Conversely, when you also talk about the idea of everybody looking for a sure hit, do you think that, on the flip side, there also is tendency nowadays to overdevelop projects? Kurtz, that has happened. I don't think it's as much of a problem as the underdeveloped project, in a way. I have known about projects that have had 8 writers and been 7 years in development that have just been so developed that they can't even be made. There's either too many costs or the script has lost all meaning because the writers forgot what the original concept was. On the other hand, you can always point to projects like Rain Man that went through that kind of process, 7 or 8 writers, lots of directors and years of development. And it turned out fine. I don't know if there's anything inherently wrong with the process. I think that as long as the focus is trying to make the project better, as long as that is kept as the vision, then I suppose it doesn't matter how long you spend in development. But after a while, the energy behind a project starts to wane, so I think you have to be careful. Do you think there's a difference between trying to make a project better and trying to make a project bankable? Kurtz, yes, I do. I think that, to be realistic, no producer or director wants to lose money on a project, or they don't want to lose their investors' money. Most, I think, are responsible enough to look at a project and say, okay, this is a worthwhile risk at 25 million, but not at 50, and that's how they kind of pursue it. I certainly do that, and always have. Looking at a script and saying, yes, I think a target audience might go see this one. When we proposed Star Wars to the studios, no one wanted to consider it, primarily because it was science fiction, and science fiction wasn't popular in the mid-70s. There hadn't been any real space opera type of science fiction since Forbidden Planet from the mid-50s, so it certainly wasn't considered popular then. But, what seems to be the case generally is that the studio executives are looking for what was popular last year, rather than trying to look forward to what might be popular next year. to set a trend as opposed to following one. Kurtz: yes, because they're afraid of the audience. No one's been able to read the audience, ever, so you have to kind of rely on your own instincts. In the case of Star Wars, George and I had dinner one night, and we were looking through the paper while we were editing American Graffiti. We were looking through the newspaper, looking at the film listings to see if there was anything out there worth going to see. And there wasn't. Discussion came around to Flash Gordon, and wouldn't it be great to have a Flash Gordon kind of science fiction movie? That would be great. We'd love to see that. That's sort of the gestation of Star Wars, and that was based on something that we wanted to see, that we would pay to go see. And no one was making it. I think that that has to be one of the major driving forces behind any project. Would I go see this? I know there was also the adage. I think it was David Putnam, actually, who said in one of his interviews that he wanted to make sure that everything that he put his name on, he would be proud to have his family go see. And I think that that's important, too. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't do tough projects. You couldn't do an R-rated project because you don't want your 6-year-old to go see it. It's just the concept that, if you're proud of what you do and what's up there on the screen, then that means that you've put energy and effort into it and you believe in it. And you actually enjoy having your name attached to it. Kurtz: yes. So it's more of a pride in work issue, as opposed to an age bracket issue, when you talk about that family quote. Kurtz: yes, yes. Exactly. Backtracking just a little bit, we were talking about towards the beginning of your career, working on the lower budget films. How did you transition to mainstream Hollywood work? What was the process for doing that? Kurtz: it was quite convoluted, actually. 66 I think it was. It was at the height of the Vietnam War. I was drafted into the Marines, and I spent 3 years in the Marines as a cameraman, a director of documentaries, even though I was actually a conscientious objector and I never carried a weapon. I carried an empty pistol holster. I was just very lucky, actually, to come through unscathed. I had 4 or 5 close friends who were also cameramen who were killed. That took a big chunk of time out, and I got out in '69, and Easy Rider came out in '69. That was sort of the beginning of the rebel era. When I talk to filmmakers now and say that I made most of my films in the '70s, at first anyways, most of the film students now look upon that era as sort of a wonderful golden age of independent filmmakers and doing interesting projects. If you look at the films that came out in the '70s as opposed to the '80s and '90s, that is true to a certain extent. But I realized that when I was a film student, I looked back at the '30s as sort of the golden age of Hollywood. I would have liked to have been working in the '30s, so perspective changes of course, every decade. What, for you, defined a golden age? Kurtz: well, I think that for us, when I was a film student, the reason that the '30s were looked upon that way is because it was the big studio system. Every studio was turning out 40 or 50 films a year. It meant that almost anything got made, good, bad and indifferent. Now sure, there were a lot of crap movies and there were a lot of pot boilers, but there were a lot of really wonderful films that came through that system. The John Fords and Howard Hawks of the world would make 3, 4 films a year. So, I suppose as a film student looking at that, when you have to struggle to put together $1 million to make a little film, the idea that the system was all in place and there was no struggle really, you just got a script or you presented a script, and you made one picture after another, there was a big advantage to that system. There are a lot of detriments to that system, too, but I think the end result was that a lot of really good films came out of that. When we were film students in the early '60s, what was being churned out wasn't particularly good, and there weren't very many films. It was difficult to get into the industry, and so it just didn't compare at all. The film students now looking back at the '70s are looking on it as everybody's read the Raging Bull's book, and other books about the '70s, and the films that were made during that time. Bob Rafelson's films and Francis's films, and Marty's films, Bogdanovich's first film, The Last Picture Show, and all the beginnings of that kind of independent filmmaker era. Many more of the '70s films have this. Not all of them, but a great many of them have this imprint as sort of non-studio, independent, interestingly structured stories. What would be classified by today's Hollywood as sort of art-housey kind of movies. Do you think that the rise of the director as a force during the 70s almost led to that sort of bubble being self-destructive? I mean, when you look at what happens towards the end of the 70s, and what happened in the 80s when the implosion of egos occurred. Kurtz: yes, I do, actually. I think that may have been inevitable. I think that also, there was another factor. In 80 or 81, I think, most of the major studios were starting to get taken over by the conglomerates. That was another big factor in the change. Corporatization? Kurtz: yes. As a producer, when did you notice a sort of seismic shift in that? Kurtz: I think it was in the early 80s, really, in talking to the studios about projects and trying to get some interest in the making of things, and spending all this time in trying to develop projects the studios weren't sure about. One of the most frustrating things ever, for any producer or director or writer even, is this process of pitching an idea, getting someone interested in it, getting development money, and going ahead and writing the screenplay, putting together a package, and then presenting it to them, and they say, "Oh, well, I'm not sure, really. Let's see what happens," and they never make it. And they're not willing to give it up, they're not willing to put it into turnaround so that you can take it somewhere else, because they're afraid that it will be the ET problem of becoming a big hit for some other studio and making you look silly. So they just put it on the shelf, and I don't know how many projects I've been involved with that ended up that way and never got made. Projects with a good idea, good stories, good screenplay, they could have been made, and did have interest from other companies, and they could have been financed. Anybody you talk to probably would tell you stories about that. It's not uncommon, and it is one of the problems that didn't seem to be the case in the 70s. Almost everything that got fully developed got financed by somebody. During the early 70s, wasn't it still the case that a good deal of the people running the studios at the time were good people? Wasn't that still the age of the creative studio head? Kurtz: pretty much. I mean, it was the tail end of the dynasties, of the big executives. Universal was still being run by Lew Wasserman. He had very eccentric tastes, and he made a lot of very commercial movies, you know, the pillow talk kind of movies, and the things that we now look at saying, well, that's sort of middle of the road, high gloss, soap opera kind of stuff, that hasn't held up that well in terms of great classics of all times, but it was very popular at the time. They also made a lot of other movies. They sprung to make Jaws, they made Duel, and they did American Graffiti. They did all this low-budget stuff as well. I think that there are parallels with most of the other studios. The year that Star Wars was released, 1977, Fox had Fred Zinnemann's Julia out that year, and Herb Ross's The Turning Point. I think that those were the two other major pictures that they had that year. Both of those are very good, solid films, and very different. They had a lot of other films, too. More formula kind of films, but they seemed to have more variety. All the studios had more variety. Now everyone wants another Jurassic Park, and they don't want to have a great variety. As you mentioned earlier, this idea of assigning certain projects as prestige projects, it didn't matter if they made money because the studio's name was on them and they looked good. They don't do that now. They're not interested in doing that. Right, if there were dinosaurs that hit big last year, let's have dinosaurs again this year. Kurtz: yes. It's almost as if the film industry has taken over the mentality of television, as far as what's the bankable formula for the year. Kurtz: yeah, but the way things are working, television, not broadcast television so much, especially in America, but cable television, HBO especially, has taken over the sort of vanguard of interesting programming. A lot of little movies that would have come out in the cinema in the 70s now come out as an HBO movie, because it's too costly to market it to the cinemas. Do you think that's a recourse, or do you think that's a situation of, well, that's the best we can get nowadays when it comes to that kind of diversity in the industry? Kurtz: I think that it's a combination. I think there's a realistic feeling that these films have a limited audience. And it costs a fortune to put them into the cinemas with the cost of prints and how many screens you have to put them in to cover the country effectively. Then there's also this mania about big numbers in the first weekend or two. I think everyone forgets that Star Wars, or any of the films that came out in the 70s, tended to be platformed, where they came out in a few cinemas. Star Wars was released only in 37 cinemas. That would be laughable today. Then they expanded it. It did better than Fox thought, I have to say that, and so they expanded it earlier than they thought they would, but it never was in more than 700 cinemas at one time. Now, your average high-budget potboiler movie, like Pearl Harbor, Mummy Returns, and the rest, they all released in 3,000 cinemas. That's a big expenditure on prints. And 95% of films don't even run longer than a couple months. Kurtz, that's right. Star Wars was still in the cinema 6 months after it opened. And then what, it was re-released the following year? Kurtz, well, actually, some of the cinemas carried it for a whole year, and then it was re-released the following summer. That's true, in a kind of weird pattern that Fox had. That pattern isn't used anymore for any picture, it has nothing to do with the commerciality of the picture. If you look at a good movie this last summer, a big hit, like Shrek. It was released in 2,500 cinemas and it wasn't around in the theater, even though it was doing really well, it kind of petered out, after about 10-12 weeks. That's a change in the audience pattern, to a certain extent. Everybody wants to see the new thing. If you were to apply today's theories to when Star Wars was released, if that had been a huge release on, say, 3,500 screens, similar to Episode I, and it played for a month, made its money then, the same amount of money it would have made in the year and a half that it eventually played through the platformed release, do you think that the film would have had the same impact? Kurtz, no, I don't, actually. It's really difficult to try to compare that. First of all, we were very lucky in the sense that Star Wars came out in the summer of '77 when there wasn't anything else to compete with it, really. The other big picture that was coming out in May, June in that period was supposed to be Willy Friedkin's The Sorcerer, the remake of Wages of Fear. And it tanked, basically. It was a terrible movie. I would agree with that. Kurtz, there's no reason to remake Wages of Fear at all. But, even if you were going to remake it, you should have made a better picture than that. But, to our benefit, it didn't stay in the cinemas more than 3 weeks. There was no competition at all, so in effect, Star Wars had the summer. Combined with that, we had the additional publicity value of the fact that, in the first month, there were huge queues around the block. We knew there were a certain number of science fiction fans who were anticipating it and would come the first week. We knew it would be full houses for the first week or so, but the way we sold it to Fox was on the basis that we thought we could make our money back from our hardcore science fiction audience. And we didn't have to rely on it being a breakthrough picture. There wasn't anybody in marketing that we could make believe that this project had a wide audience potential. Continue on to the second part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz, in which Kurtz discusses the difficulties Star Wars went through during development, the film industry of the 1970s, how George Lucas changed from the days of American Graffiti to the end of The Empire Strikes Back, the importance of the pre-production process, and more. This is the second part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz. To access the first installment, use the above navigation links. If there was criticism that Star Wars got from the studio during development, what was it? Kurtz, it was too difficult to understand. I have to admit that the script was difficult, because you couldn't see any of the visual effects, all you read were dialogue scenes, some of which seemed like gobbledygook. The talking robots and the giant Wookiees, all of that kind of stuff that doesn't read very well on the page. It's a very visual experience, science fiction in general, and Star Wars in particular. Without being absorbed into that environment, it was very difficult to explain to someone what it was going to be like. Whereas some scripts read in a very literary way, they read like a Steinbeck novel. They read wonderfully. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be great on the screen, Unfortunately, but a lot of them are. Some scripts just read better than others. We had the same problem with American Graffiti. It didn't read well at all, since it was a music-driven piece, and it was impossible to explain to anybody that the musical undercurrent of every single scene in the film had a direct impact on the audience's reaction to the scene. It was the glue that held the film together. Kurtz: absolutely. We ended up having to take a tape recorder into the executive's office and play a couple of cuts of music saying, "This is the kind of music we're going to use in the film." I even played a clip from Wolfman Jack on the radio. I can't imagine what was the reaction to playing these clips to people who, I'm assuming at that time, were middle-aged executives. Kurtz: well, it wasn't great. Also, remember that this was in 1972, the music we were playing was from 1958-59, because that was when the film was set. It wasn't contemporary pop music as far as they were concerned. It was music that was already done to death on the oldies stations. So there was already an anachronism for that? Kurtz: yeah. They just didn't understand. In fact, they refused to even license the music rights for an album. They didn't want to pay the money. And now it's gone on to be one of the most successful movie soundtrack albums of all time. Kurtz: yes, that's true. But I have to say, if I were the music executive at the time at Universal that I had to deal with, I might have decided the same thing, because all of these songs had already been released on oldies packages and oldies compilations albums, 3 or 4 times over. Why would another oldies compilation do better than any of those? And frankly, at that time, the only music soundtracks that were released were musical soundtracks, weren't they? Kurtz: yes, the pop-driven soundtracks of the Top Guns of the world hadn't come along yet. So it was basically a combination of probably Easy Rider and American Graffiti that really cemented the idea of wall-to-wall contemporary soundtracks. Kurtz: yes, right. Touching back on the transition, this is kind of non-linear, but generally my interviews tend to go that way. The conversation gets too interesting. So when you got back from Vietnam, did you come back to a different industry, in your eyes? Kurtz: well, because of Easy Rider. I had never been part of the industry, really. I had just only seen it from the outside and from the low-budget Roger Corman school, so I came back kind of into that same world, and did some work on several low-budget pictures and things. But, because of what happened with Easy Rider, the studios were all interested in odd projects. I had worked with Francis Coppola and Monty Hellman on Roger Corman projects, and Francis was just getting started with American Zoetrope in San Francisco, and I went up to see him, and I talked with him about the concept of movies. He and John Milius and the others that were talking about the industry at this time were all talking about the lunatics taking over the asylum, and the studios were dead, and we're going to have the power now. In a sense, that did happen in the 70s to a great extent, so it was all very exciting for independent film buff, filmmaker types. Monty came to me with this project, that eventually became Two-Lane Blacktop, and we put it into the Universal program. Just about 3 years ago we finally got the music rights cleared for that, and Monty and I sat and did the commentary for the DVD. Yes, it's a nice DVD. Kurtz: yeah, the quality turned out pretty good, considering that Two-Lane was shot on Techniscope back during the Technicolor 3-strip dye transfer process. So now it obviously has to be printed on Eastman color negatives. The prints that were in the cinema were quite grimy, but the DVD isn't too bad, actually. Anyway, in doing that, I realized that I hadn't seen it for a long time. You know, it's probably one of the only existential allegories made by a major studio, ever. Which is a major accomplishment for that time. Kurtz: yes. That was what, -71? Kurtz: 71, yeah. That was the atmosphere of the period, and that was actually my first brush with a major studio, that project. And even it wasn't a major studio project. The low-budget program at Universal was based on this concept that if they liked the script, and the elements were okay with them, the key cast, they in effect wrote you a check and told you to go away and come back with a finished movie. They never bothered you at all. It was a very Very good atmosphere. The only time that didn't work for Universal. I realized that when I said earlier that all of these films made under this program all are interesting films and did pretty well considering their costs, I forgot to mention the one film which was the last one in this program, that in effect killed the program, was Dennis Hopper's The Last Movie, which turned out to be an absolute mess. That would be a project killer. Kurtz, yup. And it was made under the same basis. He went off and he made the movie and nobody interfered, and he came back with a movie that was incomprehensible. It looked like it had been run through a food processor and just cut together at random. But I guess, when you have that kind of trust in a system like that, eventually something like that's going to slip in. Kurtz, yup, that's true. It's the fact that there are filmmakers around who are not responsible enough to have the power. I think that that's exactly the dilemma. I worked briefly with Orson Welles. He was making a film, I don't know that it ever was finished. He was shooting a film and he came down to USC when I was a graduate student. He shot film students asking questions of him. Basically, talking about his career. But in effect, what he was doing was shooting material for this film he was making where the filmmaker, who was not going to be played by him, but was going to be played by John Huston, was being asked the questions. This was the concept. This is Other Side of the Wind. Kurtz, yep. But that experience led me to completely validate what other people had said about Welles, which was that Welles was a wonderful, wonderful filmmaker, but he suffered from the fact that he didn't have a team around him that knew how to control him. It's kind of like a steam engine. If a steam engine, generating steam, isn't focused so that all the steam goes out the right part, then the thing blows up. And, if it goes out the right part, then it can drive the ship or the engine very, very well. Welles' best films were the ones where he was under the auspices of a studio machine, basically, where he could use his vision within the controls that were placed upon him. So there were directional limitations? Kurtz, yes. Not just directional limitations, but working with great cameramen, and great art directors, and great editors, so that the project, like Kane, actually came to fruition and turned out well. If you look at some of Welles' later films, Mr. Arcade, and his Othello, and his Macbeth, the films are quite sad, because the potential was wonderful, and there's still a lot of brilliance there. It's just that the sound is terrible, and the photography isn't particularly good, and all of things that could have made them a lot better. So there wasn't somebody there to focus him. Kurtz, yep, exactly. If you were to compare the field is certainly widespread if you were to look at the filmmakers of the 70s, who basically have degenerated into Wellesian types. Are there any that you find saddest of all, because of the potential that you saw at the time? Kurtz, no, I don't think so. I think that you have to look upon the people working for a living in an industry. It is a combination of creativity and economics. Francis always said the only way to function is to make a film for yourself and then a film for the studio, to keep your sanity. A lot of people complain that Francis is one of those filmmakers that had this wonderful potential. The first two Godfather films are absolutely brilliant, and Godfather 3 isn't very good, and he made it because he needed money to get out of his bankruptcy situation. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. That's pretty legitimate. The fact that the film isn't very good, it did okay at the box office, the critics didn't like it, but I don't think you can expect that everything that a filmmaker turns out is going to work for everybody. Marty Scorsese's made some wonderful, personal films that will last forever, and he's made some studio films, too, that are interesting, but not particularly wonderful. But that's just the way the business is. Howard Hawks and Alfred Hitchcock made some turkeys as well. When you're evaluating an overall pattern, saying, well, they could have made some more brilliant films, yes, maybe, but consider the circumstances of the moment. Whether you need money, whether the script you're working on doesn't quite work. I know in Francis's case, for instance, on Godfather 3, he was lambasted for using his daughter in that role, and she wasn't all that great in it. She wasn't as bad as people made her out to be, either. Kurtz, no, not at all. Winona Ryder, who was cast in that role, backed out a week before the start of shooting. He didn't have anybody to fall back on. Anyway, there are all these individual circumstances, always easy to criticize from the outside. Sure, a lot of the filmmakers who were considered sort of the gods of the 70s, they more recently have made films that a lot of other people didn't like, particularly, whether they made money or not. I like to say, the greatest detriment to art is success. Kurtz: Yep, exactly. Well, I know that when talking about the directors and the authoritarian directors throwing off their shackles in the 70s and what it eventually led to. By the way, a group of friends of mine, we have something that we, ironically enough, call the Kurtz theory, which directly relates to Lucas. Essentially, it's that when you lose all checks and balances, someone who has the ability to say no to you or to convince you that this might not be the right direction, you get films like Episode I. Kurtz: Yeah. Well, I think that's true. In the case of Episode I, there's probably something else going on as well, which is it was a merchandise-driven project. They knew that the money from the merchandising would make a lot more money than the money from the film. It's a tired film, in the sense that there's no passion or energy there, and that comes from that kind of slightly cynical attitude, I think. There's a lot that could have been. In Episode I, there's a tremendous amount of story potential that was wasted. If, on balance, you're looking on it on the basis of, well, it's going to make a lot of money no matter how terrible it is, then you're going to go in not with the right kind of energy to make it right. That's not limited to Episode I, there are lots of films that are made that way. I think you have to approach every project with a kind of wonder. I didn't know Alfred Hitchcock very well. He was working at Universal when I was there, and I met him several times in Lew Wasserman's office and a couple of times around the lot, and I watched him work on Family Plot a bit. He was a fairly intimidating guy and he was ill as well, at that time. So, he wasn't his old self, I suppose. Anyway, he did say one day that when someone asked him what was his favorite film of all of his projects, he said, "The next one." I think that's a wonderful comment, because that shows that he was excited about the idea of planning something new. I think all filmmakers should feel that way, because that energy then is transported into the project. If you're tired before you start, if you're only doing it for the money, if you don't like the script, then you're going to go out every day and show up, but you're not going to transfer any of your personal energy into the project. From your personal experience, how would you compare the George you worked with on American Graffiti to the George you worked with towards the end of The Empire Strikes Back? Kurtz: It was quite different, actually. He was very different. I think the most unfortunate thing that happened was the fact that Indiana Jones came along, and Raiders of the Lost Ark had come out in between. George and I had many discussions about that, but it boiled down to the fact that he became convinced that all the audience was interested in was the roller coaster ride, and so the story and the script didn't matter anymore. Now Raiders is not a bad film, but the script actually was much better than the finished film. There were a lot more nuances in the character, and there was less action. It would have been a better picture if that script had been made. But, as it is, it's an interesting and entertaining film. It's just that this idea that somehow the energy doesn't have to be put into getting really good story elements together. One of the arguments that I had with George about Empire was the fact that he felt in the end, he said, we could have made just as much money if the film hadn't been quite so good, and you hadn't spent so much time. And I said, but it was worth it. And so it's the argument between doing the best you can, and good enough? Kurtz: Yes. And I know that there's an extreme that you can go to. I also knew Stanley Kubrick quite well, and I know that he's probably the epitome of the perfection-oriented. In fact, I think he actually was clinically obsessive-compulsive, probably, in the end. He would go to unbelievable lengths to have it be exactly the way he wanted it, and he didn't have any money problems. Warner Brothers was writing the checks and they didn't care what he did. But it still didn't matter, beyond a certain point. In my personal opinion, after Clockwork Orange, his efforts went downhill, basically. Barry Lyndon, The Shining, Full Metal Jacket, and Eyes Wide Shut all are less than interesting films, as far as I'm concerned. Well, I think they show that era of overdevelopment. They were very sterile films. Kurtz: yes, well, part of that was his own personal paranoia about being out in the world. Which he didn't have, even up to, well, he was shooting The Shining when we were preparing Empire, and I had lots of run-ins with him at the studio, and had lunch and dinner with him many times. During that time period, he was still working at the studio, he was still traveling in from his house, and he would still go to the cinema occasionally, or go out to dinner at restaurants. After The Shining was in editing, I went out to his home in St. Albans several times for dinner, and to screenings that he had there for small groups of friends. He stopped going out, and he stopped going into the world at all. The world had to come to him. I think that was the biggest problem. He holed up there, and he didn't have any contact with the rest of the world. Except on the telephone, where he would talk to people endlessly. He'd call them up in the middle of the night. That was fine, he enjoyed doing that, but I think that his contact with the world, in terms of how he interpreted the world on film, suffered. Made his perception somewhat stagnant? Kurtz: well, yes, I mean, the whole idea of doing Vietnam in East London is pretty bizarre. That's a schizophrenic film to begin with. Kurtz: well, it is, yes. And it's true that the Becton gasworks didn't look too terrible with a few palm trees around, but the reason that Apocalypse works so well is because it's shot in the environment that's exactly like it was in Vietnam. Right. Kurtz: and, it wasn't Vietnam, it was the Philippines, but it was close enough. This is a big argument that we had with the studio about two-lane blacktop, and this goes down to the sort of core of how a filmmaker really has to approach his projects. With two-lane, we had these meeting with the studio, with their production department, and they had read the script, and they had approved the script, and then they said, why not shoot it all in Southern California? We can find a lot of little towns and a lot of country roads. Both Monty and I said the whole point of the story is that it's a cross-country trip, a race, and we need the variety of environments, and we need the variety of backgrounds, we need the variety of people that these racers would encounter. Their ideas were all very practical, it would be a lot cheaper to do it that way. Also, what about weather cover? The production plan that I gave to the studio made them blanch, basically. They were appalled by the fact that we were changing locations every single day, and driving and shooting on the road while we were driving between locations. They said, how are you going to do this? What happens if the weather doesn't cooperate? We said, well, we're shooting the film in sequence, so if it's raining, we just shoot in the rain. Which did happen, actually. But see, they didn't make movies that way and they didn't believe it could be made that way. I said, look, I've worked on hundreds of Roger Corman movies, and lots of student films, and lots of documentaries. That's the way you make movies that way. You don't have the luxury of creating everything by yourself. Actually, Two-Lane is probably one of the first examples of the whole dogma concept, because it was shot in sequence. It was shot using all live dialogue, there's no underscore in the film. The only music that you hear is on the radio. There are some sound effects added, some car sound effects, that don't quite meet the dogma criteria. But it was all shot in real locations, and in all the real locations we accepted everything that was actually there. We didn't dress anything. I think that adds to the existential nature of the film. Kurtz: yes, it does. And the actors that we used, aside from War Notes, Dennis Wilson, James Taylor, and Laurie Bird, were all locals. We did a call where we actually cast some of the locals, and then came back and shot them, 3 months later. But, they were still from the area, so they seemed to fit into the environment. Which again, I'm assuming, is not the kind of thing that you can easily quantify to a studio. Kurtz: no, you can't at all. From a production point of view, the studio wants to have control of all the elements. As an ex-production manager myself, I certainly would concur with that. You want to have the peace of mind of knowing that when you hire 100 extras, that you're going to have them on the set, and you're going to have costumes for them, and that's something that you pre-planned. If you do this kind of movie, though, and you just want to show up, Like there's a scene in Tulane where James gets fed up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he gets out of the car and he goes to a bar, and that bar was a bar in Santa Fe on Saturday night. All the people that were in there were people that were in there. We only shot 2 scenes in there, so we only were in there about 3 hours. We had pre-lived the bar in the afternoon, when it was closed, so we just turned on the lights, asked the people if they wanted to be in the movie, and shot the scenes. And that was the end of it. You just don't make Hollywood movies that way. They would have vetted everybody and used the place that was closed, and brought their own people in there. Because, if they had had to shoot for 3 days, they would want to know that they could get them back. But again, knowing that those are authentic locals, that's a very tangible quality that you see on screen. Kurtz: yes, I think that you can use whatever production method works for you. There's no one best way. But, you have to have the experience to know how to do that, how to take advantage of that. As a producer, what's the middle ground that you find? I mean, you don't want complete anarchy, either. Kurtz: no, you don't want complete anarchy, but you look at the scenes. I mean, if half of your picture takes place in an apartment, on the 37th floor of some building in New York, you might want to consider building that in the studio, because you're going to be in there for 4 weeks. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to shoot that on location. If you're talking about street scenes where it's all done in one day, there's no reason, and I've done it many times, why you just can't put the camera in a second-floor window and shoot scenes with hidden cameras and shoot real people on the street. We did it in Hong Kong, we did it in India, and we've done it in many places in Europe. And it works extremely well. You get much more believable street scenes. On the other hand, if you do a film like Tootsie, where they have street scenes in New York City where everybody walks into the camera lens where you're dollying down the street at an extra, it looks that way. Now, for that film, it didn't matter much, because that was the style of that film. It's a good film, it's funny, it's worth watching anyway. But, if you were doing a harder-edged film, then you might consider doing it a different style. I think that that's the kind of thing that you decide in pre-production. You look at what works best for the story you're telling. It doesn't fit any particular pattern. When you look at filmmaking nowadays, do you think there's a greater interference by the studio in determining those kind of things in pre-production? Kurtz: I don't know, really. I wouldn't think so. I think it's just a lack of effort on the filmmaker's part. I seriously doubt if the studio would say, you have to do it this way. They don't much care. As long as they know that it will be done on time, and the script is approved, I think they don't much care how you do it. It's just a matter of does the director want to spend the effort. So it's that good enough mentality? Kurtz: it's that good enough mentality, yeah. You do just the minimum you have to get by. Or, on the other hand, like Pearl Harbor, you do all of these razzle-dazzle CGI shots that don't add anything to the film, except add length, and aren't very interesting. Because you don't have a decent script to begin with. Kurtz: exactly. So you're wasting your time. All the energy is put in the wrong place. Well, do you think that the industry over time, when you talk about pre-production in the golden age, the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and so on, where a lot of time was spent to make sure all the ducks were in a row, do you think that filmmakers today have lost the concept of foundation building? Putting together a team? Kurtz: well, that's a pretty general statement. I'm sure there are lots of examples of that. I think that there are still filmmakers around that can do that, and do it quite well. There are good movies that are still being made, fortunately. So I don't think it's lost, particularly. I think it's a matter of expediency. It's also a matter of the time you spend in pre-production. I'm a big believer in long pre-production time. In American Graffiti, we had no money, but we had to have all these cars, so we spent 3 weeks advertising on rock and roll radio for cars to be in this movie. Cars and drivers who looked vaguely late 50s. We had about 300 people show up, and we took a picture of the car and the driver and took their details, and each night when we needed cars we'd put out this call and call about 40-50 people, and maybe 20 would show up. It didn't cost us anything, It was free, we just had to feed them. That was the only way we could make the production value work for the money we had, but it took 3 weeks of work to build that database of people to do it. Now, if you only have 2 weeks of pre-production, which a lot of these smaller films try to squeeze by with now, you're not going to have time to do that. I think it's really critical. I'm a big believer that for every week of shooting, you need 2 to 3 weeks of pre-production, and I don't care what level the picture is. As a matter of fact, if it's a small picture, you probably need more pre-production than you do if it's a big picture, where you have a huge pre-production staff that can help you. And that kind of pre-production pays off in spades when the film itself runs smoothly, doesn't it? Kurtz: Oh, it certainly does, it certainly does. Unfortunately, a lot of contemporary films, mostly big, not too much small ones anymore, have a deadline for release, which means, before you start shooting, you know you have to deliver by a certain date. It cuts your possibilities. In both American Graffiti and Star Wars, the studio had no deadline on when the film should be finished. It wasn't going to decide on how it was going to release it until after it saw something put together. So there was no pre-release date. That's the ideal kind of setup. Now, if you're going into production on a film in September, probably there's a May, June or July release date staring you in the face already, which means that you have to take that into consideration when you plan your schedule. Do you sometimes think that if one of these productions, instead of rushing right in, had taken an extra week, regardless, you still have the said date, that a week's extra pre-production might save a week and a half, 2 weeks towards the end because you could finalize that script, you could finalize that design, instead of this mentality or working on the fly as you go along? Kurtz: Sure. On Godfather I, Francis spent a tremendous amount of time sitting with the script and writing these copious notes about every single scene. Everything from, the scene where Sonny is driving in the car, and goes down to the toll booth and gets shot. Francis had all these notes about driving during the war, that was during the Second World War, and all these people who'd lived through it were talking about the fact that the roads were completely empty, because rubber and petrol were all rationed. So that scene has virtually no cars in it, there are no cars on the road. The studio saw the rushes and said, "Where's all the traffic?" And Francis said, "There isn't any traffic, because it's during the war, and there wouldn't be any traffic." It's just little things like that. If you have the time to spend with your script, and you can think about it and write down all the thoughts that you have about it, that'd be a big help. Jean Renoir said in an interview we did with him when we were film students, I worked on a crew that did an interview with him, spontaneity is a wonderful thing, but if it doesn't come, you have to have an elaborate plan as a backup. That's a great quote. In your personal experience, what is the worst experience and the best experience that you've had when it comes to having all your ducks in a row for a production? What defines a bad experience and what defines a good experience for you? Kurtz: Well, I think that American Graffiti is one of the best experiences, because we had the pre-production time and it was a fairly simple shoot, but it was also one of those that was done in a quasi-documentary style, which means as long as we had all of our elements together, we were fine and everything went extremely smoothly. So, that would be one of my best experiences. One of my worst was a little film I made to help out some friends here. We made it in England back in '89. Called Slipstream. I don't know if you ever saw it. I watched it a few weeks ago, in fact. Kurtz: Really? Slipstream is one of those things that actually has a lot of good elements in it, but ultimately doesn't quite work, because the energy of the film changes dramatically. It was supposed to be. The script was very, very hard-edged, heavy rough, and gritty. A rougher than Blade Runner kind of look at the future, basically. Then a week before shooting, the financiers, which were an English company, decided that it had to be a family film, so all of the rough stuff had to be taken out. And, frantically, we worked on rewriting various bits, even after shooting started, and the film ends up a bit of a mess, because the focus and the energy that was there originally gets dissipated in trying to make something out of something that wasn't there in the first place. I don't know what your impression of the film is. It seemed very disjointed. Kurtz: it's very disjointed, big chunks of story that disappear completely, that were never even shot. I begged them to let us postpone shooting for 6 weeks so that we could restructure the thing, and they wouldn't do it, so it was a very, very annoying and frustrating experience for me. I hated it. I'm a big flying buff, and I liked flying. I spent a month flying microlights and picking the aircraft, which I think was one of the best part of the film. Yes, I would have to agree. That definitely seemed like the film that went from A to B to D to R to Z. Kurtz: exactly, and that's a very good case in point of what not to do. If the rules change and you have to regroup, then you just need to fall back and spend the time to regroup and do a decent job. At what point did you become involved with American Graffiti? Kurtz: right away, actually. What happened with American Graffiti was that, before we made Tulane, I told you I had visited Francis at Zoetrope in San Francisco, and we talked about other projects and things, and one of those things was a Vietnam War movie, which was Apocalypse Now. At that time it was a script that John Milius had written for George to direct. They were just finishing THX, and I was the only person in all the people that Francis knew, or any of his group there, that had been in the military and knew anything about the military. On one of the occasions when I was up there, I was staying at Francis's house, and we had spent a lot of time on a variety of things. He drove me out to George's house to do some editing on THX, because I wanted to see what Techniscope looked like because I was considering using Techniscope for Tulane, and THX was shot on Techniscope as well. So we went out and ran a part of the film at George's house and sat and chatted with George about Techniscope and things in general. That was the first time I had ever met George. What were your initial impressions? Kurtz: he seemed very much a typical film editor type, very quiet, not very assertive, certainly not a Hollywood type at all. So we went away from that, and we did use Techniscope, and I was going to use some of Francis's equipment, his Techniscope cameras, but in the end they were being used for something else, so I had to get Techniscope cameras from somewhere else in Hollywood. When Tulane was finished shooting and we were editing it, Francis rang me up again, and I went back up to San Francisco and we had several other meetings about this war film, the John Milius script. We decided to try to put it together, and Francis's company owned the rights, and George was now finished with THX and Columbia was interested in Apocalypse. This was after Tulane was finished and delivered. I spent about 6 months scouting for locations and doing a lot of legwork and research on jungles and helicopters for Apocalypse. The reason that Apocalypse is shot in the Philippines is because that's the only place that had helicopters and jungle to match. Every place else I looked at, there's a lot of great jungles around, South America and lots of other places, but no helicopters available. Then Columbia got cold feet because the war was still going on, and the approach that we had to making Apocalypse was to do it all in 16mm, all handheld, all quasi-documentary style, and actually hire a couple of Japanese crews to go into Vietnam and shoot stock footage in the real country. We couldn't go there to do that, but a Japanese crew could. You could have just parachuted John Milius in. Kurtz: yeah, that's right. I'm sure he was eager to volunteer for that. Kurtz: yes, I'm sure. Eventually Columbia got cold feet and said, well, the atmosphere is not conducive to a comedy about the Vietnam War. Remember that the original script for Apocalypse was much closer to MASH than it was to Heart of Darkness. It had quite a bit of black humor, and it isn't the film that Francis made. He rewrote the script considerably, and changed a lot of the things. Now, his film is a very good film, but it's just different, that's all. It's completely different than the one we were going to make. So Columbia backed out. And George said, I've got this idea about a rock and roll movie I've always wanted to make, about cruising. We started talking about that, which eventually became American Graffiti. Continue on to the third part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz, in which Kurtz discusses the making of American Graffiti, the difficulties in pitching Star Wars to the studios, George Lucas' work methods, what was originally going to be in SW, and more. This is the third part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz. To access previous installments, use the above navigation links. IGNF was the concept of American Graffiti pretty much what made it to screen? Kurtz: the idea was there, it was about a bunch of kids hanging out, on one night. There were several versions of the script that went through, and Willard and Gloria Hike added their version of the final draft, which added a lot of humor and clever dialogue. But it was pretty much from the original idea, in terms of the concept and what it was about. IGNF: it was adding a little bit more warmth to it? Kurtz: yes. When American Graffiti was finished, it became a surprise hit, really. The studio didn't know what to do with it. They had an exhibitor screening, and the exhibitors all liked it, but the marketing people said, how are we going to sell this film? It doesn't have anybody in it. IGNF: except for Opie. Kurtz: yes, Ronnie Howard. But, Ned Tannen said, well, the critics will probably like it. It's a good, solid, critics film. So, they came up with this plan to release it in one cinema in New York and one cinema in Los Angeles, and hoped that the critical response was good enough so that they could help sell the rest of the exhibitors around the rest of the country. They had already pre-sold certain territories, almost playing it as a second half of a double bill, which still were floating around at that time, but to Lew Wasserman's credit, when the film opened in New York and Los Angeles and the critical responses were very good, he forced the sales department to cancel all those bookings and they rethought the whole thing, and it was released on a much more word-of-mouth kind of basis. Now that is the film that had a very interesting history in terms of its release, in the 10th and 15th week of it playing in this single cinema in New York and Los Angeles, it was doing better business than it did in the first 2 or 3 weeks. That proved that the technique was correct for that film. It certainly was what sold the film, the word of mouth and the good critical response. I was in New York on the night it opened. I went to the opening screening and listened to the audience. I had seen it thousands of times. This is one of the hard things about a film that you've made, is you find that it's almost impossible to sit through anymore. IGNF: just because of sheer repetition? Kurtz: yeah, just the repetition of everything. So I sat there and listened to the audience, and I said, well, reaction wasn't bad. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. I went from there to Universal afterwards, and we waited until midnight, went out to dinner and then came back to the studio office in New York in 5th Avenue and waited for the papers to come out at midnight, and went through them with a fine-tooth comb looking at all the reviews and pulling review quotes to put in the ads. The reviews were generally very, very favorable, and we were very pleased, and it made a huge difference to their confidence about how to handle the picture. That was really what happened with American Graffiti. Then it went on to win a Best Picture Oscar nomination, which was totally out of the blue. No one thought of that one at all. Compared to the other pictures that were around that year, there was no reason for it to be nominated for anything, because it just didn't make that much impact. But, you never know, the voters are a strange group. Then immediately after that, that was part of a 2-picture deal, actually, American Graffiti. I forgot a little bit of the story, which was we had a script development deal with United Artists. 2 pictures, one was this rock and roll movie, and the other one was a science fiction movie. United Artists didn't like the script for American Graffiti, and passed on the rest of the deal, basically, and we ended up taking that deal to Universal to make American Graffiti as part of that program. Francis loaned us his name, really, as executive producer, because the studio wanted some known name associated with the picture. So he in effect loaned us his name to be on the picture. IGNF: and at one time was going to purchase the picture, wasn't he? Kurtz: well, it was never serious. He wishes he had. Actually, he could have made a lot more money. After American Graffiti was made, the other part of this deal was this science fiction script, and Universal looked at the first treatment, first draft, of Star Wars and passed on it. IGNF: which was radically different from what made it to screen, right? Kurtz: well, yes, radically, but they just weren't interested in science fiction at all at that time. IGNF: there hadn't been anything, so this would be, what-74. So at that time, The most recent science fiction film was still, Silent Running came out in 74 or 75? Kurtz, I think it was 74, and that was a Universal picture, too, but it wasn't a good sign, because it didn't do all that well. It made its money back, but it was like American Graffiti in the sense that it was part of the under $1 million program, but it didn't make anything like the box office impact that American Graffiti did. If it had, then maybe Universal might have been interested. So the last science fiction film, basically, still was 2001? Kurtz, yep, and 2001 wasn't a good example, because it took 5 years to make its money back. And it wasn't a space opera. Kurtz, no, it wasn't. Definitely not. What were the difficulties, and what did you see as the process, in trying to pitch Star Wars to the studios? Obviously, it didn't get made at Universal where American Graffiti had been a hit. Kurtz, we were obligated to present it to Universal, which we did, and they passed on it from the concept stage, the treatment, primarily because Lew Wasserman just didn't think much of science fiction at that time, didn't think it had much of a future then, with that particular audience. It's very easy to look back on that now and see that as a terrible idea, but a lot of studios executives felt that, because science fiction had proved to be inordinately unsuccessful. Partially because a lot of the science fiction projects that came along in the late 60s and 70s were very apocalyptic and very negative, kind of down, end of the world kind of stories. Also, a lot of the science fiction writing in that period, novels, was that same way, so the movie business just didn't think there was much in there for it. Although Star Wars wasn't like that at all, it was just sort of lumped into the same kind of category. And, I'm assuming there were also concerns regarding budget for the film? Kurtz, well, yes and no, up to a point. We said the whole idea was to make it low budget, Roger Corman style, and the budget was never going to be more than, well, originally we had proposed about $8 million, it ended up being about 10. Both of those figures are very low budget by Hollywood standards at the time. What would be the average film cost at that time? Kurtz, I would say a regular comedy of that time probably cost about 20 to 22. Depends on, above 1, cast costs of course, and a more expensive action-adventure picture with visual effects would probably be anywhere from 25 to 35. That would be considered expensive. So 10 would be a real bargain as far as they're concerned, for an effects picture. At any point, were you and George discouraged enough to consider other projects? Kurtz, yes, there was a thought that possibly science fiction wouldn't sell to anybody, after so many people turned it down. But we persisted, partially because other people had read it and said, yeah, it could be a good idea. It was worth going the whole route just to see how it played out, basically, and Fox became interested partially because Alan Ladd was willing to take a couple of chances, and partially because American Graffiti had been successful financially even though it was a very low-budget movie. He could present it to his board on the basis that these guys just made a successful movie for Universal, and it came in under budget, and it's worth a chance on that level alone considering that our risk factor is not that high. We did make a case for the picture on the basis that there's a hardcore science fiction audience, and because it's a low-budget picture. Even if no one came to see it except those science fiction fans, by the time it got to video it would have made its money back. On paper, that looks like a reasonably good argument, since we felt there were enough science fiction fans to probably do that. Once the film actually did get a green light, what were the difficulties then in actually mounting the production? Especially from a producer's point of view. Kurtz, we had kind of several hiccups, actually. Fox decided to go ahead and we proceeded to pick a production plan and do a more final budget with a British art department and look for locations in North Africa, and kind of pulled together some things. Then, it was obvious that $8 million wasn't going to do it. They had approved $8 million. When we said it had to be more, they got a bit scared and said, well, we want to stop everything you're doing and see how this budget thing works out. So, for about 2 weeks, we didn't really do anything except kind of pull together new budget figures, and it came out to be like 9.8 or 0.9 or something like that, and in the end they just said, yes, "That's okay, we'll go ahead." Which is what happened. We kind of restarted the preparations phase. The first big hurdle was trying to put together the right crew. Originally, as a cameraman, we had wanted Jeff Unsworth, who was a fairly famous British cameraman and had done a lot of good work, and George and I had gone down to Mexico City and visited him when they were shooting on Lucky Lady. Kind of an ill-fated Burt Reynolds picture that William and Gloria Hike had been involved in the screenplay on. It was about bootlegged gambling and bootlegged whiskey running in the 20s in America, and they were shooting down there because there were a lot of boats involved, transporting liquor across the Great Lakes. They were shooting in the Bay of California, which was a relatively easy thing to photograph. In any case, Unsworth said he was interested and we proceeded with the idea that he was going to do the picture. The very last minute he pulled out to do the Vincente Minnelli picture in Rome instead, which was really annoying, but that's the way the movie business works sometimes, because he had worked with Minnelli several times in the past and he just felt that that would probably be a better picture, I suppose. I spoke with him afterwards and he was very apologetic about it. It's not something he normally did in his career, and I think he felt guilty to a certain extent. The picture was a lot more money for him, and he had a much bigger crew, and so in a way I don't blame him. If he had just said that he'd rather work with Minnelli, someone he'd worked with before, then also he didn't know whether he could handle science fiction that well, I would have been very happy to say, then go do it. We'll get someone else. But his agent made a big thing about the fact that there was some kind of technical prior commitment, which was all bullshit. It wasn't, and he didn't say anything to us directly about it until after the film was over. It was a bit annoying. And then he did science fiction shortly thereafter, as one of his final films. Kurtz: yes, I know, that's kind of the way things go. So we had to look around for another cameraman, and it ended up being fine, although George and Gil Taylor didn't get along all that well. Gil did a very good job on the picture. He hadn't done very much in the way of visual effects, so he was a little nervous about some of effects shots. But most of the VistaVision stuff that involved process and mat work I shot myself. How did that work out, as far as the actual process of dividing up who did what? Kurtz: it wasn't really a formal thing. We started shooting the picture and when we got to those shots, most of them were done in a quasi-second unit fashion, except for the big finale in the throne room. That wasn't. And Gil just said he didn't want to be responsible for the camera work there because it was a complicated series of mats, and I said, fine, just do the lighting and I'll worry about the shots. It wasn't really that complicated, it was just a locked-down camera and we moved the extras around on the floor. All this stuff sounds very archaic now. It all could be done digitally and no one would think twice about it. But at that time, what had to happen was the camera had to be very clearly locked off, and each section of the extras standing in their line had to be shot piece by piece in about 8 different sections so we'd have a room full of people when they were all mounted together. Then on top of that, we did one where all of the extras dressed up in a variety of costumes stood along the front line right in the middle, and did the scene with the actors walking down the aisle up to the end where the throne was. A very standard kind of matte shot that has been done on hundreds of pictures since the 1920s, and as I say now it looks quite archaic, working that way, because it's so time-consuming, but it worked fine then. It seems very odd to me that a cinematographer would actually admit that he wasn't able to do something. Kurtz: yes, that was a bit surprising to me as well. But I think he was just afraid that maybe there was something about some of the visual effects that we were doing he didn't quite understand, since he wasn't shepherding that all the way through. Also, as they say, he and George didn't get along all that well. In what context were their arguments? Kurtz: there were several times when George had run-ins with the art department as well, because he was used to working on low-budget films where he had to come up with all the solutions. So instead of saying, what I'd really like to see here is something really interesting, and then the art department would go off and do it, he would say things like, put a new kind of antennae on that building and a funnel on this one. And John Barry, after a while he'd say, just tell me what you'd like to see, and let me deal with the details. That's what you're paying me for. So it was delegation problems? Kurtz: yes, it was that. With the camera, it was the same thing. In a couple of scenes in the corridors, rather than saying, "It looks a bit overlit, can you fix that?" he'd say, "Turn off this light, and turn off that light." And Gil would say, "No, I won't do that, I've lit it the way I think it should be, tell me what's the effect that you want, and I'll make a judgment about what to do with my lights." Which seems pretty reasonable. Kurtz: yes, it does, but George had never worked with a crew like that before, and he also didn't like being here in England at all. He didn't like the food. And he found that he wasn't the kind of director that chatted with the crew. He very rarely talked to anybody, except directly for instructions, and even then there wasn't a lot. Both the actors on American Graffiti and Star Wars complained that he didn't say enough to give them any feedback. That wasn't completely true, but it happened a lot where he would just say, "Let's try it again a little bit faster." That was about the only instruction he'd give anybody. A lot of actors don't mind, they don't care, they just get on with it. But some actors really need a lot of pampering and a lot of feedback, and if they don't get it, they get paranoid that they might not be doing a good job. Is that kind of lack of communication just inherent in George's character? Kurtz: partially. I think it's the fact that George came out of a documentary film background. His style was to shoot a lot of footage and sit in the editing room and put it all together. He wasn't gregarious, he's very much a loner and very shy, so he didn't like large groups of people, he didn't like working with a large crew, he didn't like working with a lot of actors. Ironic he would choose science fiction, which normally requires a lot of all of that. Kurtz: the things that he liked the best were working in writing, which was pretty solitary, and working in the editing room, which was also solitary. It was fine. It was just that the crew expected a little more gregariousness from the director, and they kind of resented it, that it wasn't that way. They complained a lot. It was very nitpicky. How, as a producer, did you smooth over the rough edges? Kurtz: well, some of it was just talking to them, basically, instead of him, which was fine. Even the actors, it was helpful for them sometimes to hear that things looked good, the rushes looked good, and they were doing fine, things were all working out. It's very, very shallow level stuff, but it's just something that they like to hear. The famous stories of just how depressed George was on that film and frustrated, do you think a lot of that was self-created? Kurtz: some of it was, and I'm sure you realize that a lot of directors have an idea in their head of how they'd like to see things. Very rarely does it turn out that way. You have to settle for something in between because it's a compromised group effort. Yes, it can be quite frustrating, and I think he was, as I said earlier. There were a combination of things. He didn't like living here, he didn't like the weather, he didn't like working with the crew that much, and he felt it wasn't working out all that well, and he thought maybe it'll help if we move faster, and yes, he did get quite depressed during part of the shooting. But it came and went, and by the end he seemed happy and he got a lot of what he needed. He knew the visual effects were important, so just looking at the live action footage was a bit difficult to judge what the end result was going to be like. For the actors as well, I'm sure. Kurtz: oh, for the actors especially. They were just doing scenes in front of blue screen, or in front of black velvet, and they had no idea what the end result was going to look like. Originally, we were going to shoot the cockpit scenes from projectors, with front projected backgrounds, but ILM didn't come up with any backgrounds for us, so the day came to shoot the first front projection shots, and they had failed to deliver these backgrounds, which was a bit scary for us, because we didn't know what they were doing back in Los Angeles. They were supposed to have these ready, and they didn't. So we had to use the front projector as a blue screen projection rig, basically, as an emergency, which we did. As it turned out, it actually was a better idea to do it that way, because we could time the background look and what happened in what frames better than we could have done it if we had done it in front projection. So it was one of those happy accidents? Kurtz: happy accidents that worked out fine. But it did make us a little wary of John Dykstra and the ILM people, and when we finished the live-action shoot and went back to California, they still hadn't produced one shot, So we were quite worried, and in the end we sort of got them together. I had to bring in a couple of other production managing types, and they were doing some things that were just incredibly time-consuming, and we set up how they were functioning. Were they just unfocused? Kurtz: No, they were quite focused. To give you an example, they would set up an elaborate rig for a shot, and they would shoot an element of the shot, and they'd send it off to the lab for processing, and it would come back from the lab the next day, and they'd look at it, and they'd say it was good or not. If it wasn't good, they'd redo it. Well, that tied up the equipment for that one shot, and the stage for that, for at least 24 hours or more, and most of the time, the shots were fine. I said, don't do that. Shoot the shot, break down the setup, set up something else, and shoot that. Send it into the lab. If we have to reset up and do it over again, then we have to do that, but it doesn't happen often enough to worry about leaving it set up until you see that the dailies are okay. So, that was one big thing that saved a tremendous amount of time. The other thing was having people work at night, a night crew on some of the simple shots, who could come in and set up and shoot certain things, background plates and things. So we could sort of double the speed, rather than having everybody work at the same time. There were a lot of little things. Creatively they were fine, it was just from a management point of view. They were not functioning as well as they could have been. They needed a shot foreman? Kurtz: Well, yes, that's primarily it. We put together the team there from a variety of disparate elements. None of those people had worked together before. Some of them had worked on architectural model building, and some of them had worked on commercial effects houses who'd been doing titles and opticals, and they came from a lot of different backgrounds. So anytime you encounter something like this, with a team working for the first time, it's not easy. With all those special effects, was there ever a point in time where there was a fear that it wouldn't come together? Kurtz: Yes, we were worried about getting them done in time, and we had had a very difficult time trying to get explosions to look good. We had to bring in an outside person, a kind of pyrotechnics person, really, and try to find another location with high ceilings, because we needed to put the camera looking straight up to shoot these explosions so that, when you saw the explosion, it looked like a space explosion rather than having all this stuff fall toward the ground. The only way to do that was to shoot straight up, so you couldn't tell. We did find a place like this, and they shot dozens of explosions, cheap. For us to use about 8, we must have shot 200-300, just for us to use 8 or 9 in the film. That was one of the weak things we were really worried about. There were a couple of other effects shot where we could never get them to fit together right, the various elements. There was always something wrong, one of the elements was wrong, or the color wasn't right, or the matte line showed. I think there were 2 shots that we did over again at least 10 times, and still didn't get them right, and had to end up leaving them out of the show. And yet, some of the more difficult ones, what we perceived as more difficult ones, went through on the first composite. So they were fine, and very easy. You never can tell in advance. Especially with opticals in that period. Kurtz: Yes. There are so many things that can go wrong. The whole process of shooting against blue screen so that you can extract female mattes, and make male mattes from that and then do holdouts on the background, all of that stuff is fraught with potential errors. If the processing chemical temperature is 1 degree off, the film will shrink slightly and there'll be a jiggle, possibly, in the matte line, or the color could be off and you can't get the 2 parts to match color-wise without doing it over 4-5 times. You can't see what the result is until you see it finished and processed. It takes 2-3 days each time you composite it, to see what the result is like. But the shift of the film elements, due to temperature or processing chemicals is the worst, and it always has been that way. You have to be really meticulous on how you do all that, and even then you might have to do it over 5-6 times to do it right. All of that's a thing of the past now, of course, since you're doing it on computers, digital. Not only can you see it instantly, you don't have any of those photographic process problems. So, I seriously doubt if anyone would want to go back to that kind of technique for complicated shots. For simple shots it's probably easier to do it photographically, and a lot cheaper. For complicated shots, it's much easier to do them digitally if you're careful. In assembling the film, were there any concerns in the editing room of pulling things together, as far as story-wise? Kurtz: yes, we had quite a few. One of the reasons we dropped out a big chunk of the story on Tatooine in the early part of the script was because we couldn't get it to fit together. The original script called for the start of the film to be exactly the way it is in the film now, starting with the battle in space and the robots. Then in the middle of that, we cut down to Tatooine where Luke Skywalker's working, and he looks up with these electrical binoculars at this space battle and he muses to himself about how he'd love to be part of a big battle, go to the academy. Then he gets in his speeder and races into Anchorhead to tell his friends, who were hanging out at the Tatooine equivalent of a pool hall there, and they all tell him to go get lost, because they're not interested in spaceships. Then he talks to Biggs, who is at the academy, or has graduated from the academy and come back to see his parents, briefly about wanting to go. It's all about longing to get away, really. But we found we couldn't insert that in the middle of the battle scene, because we didn't know who any of these people were. And it was really difficult to follow, story-wise. We ended up doing what any good writer would have recommended in the first place, I suppose. Stay with your key story elements. In this case, the robots were the first characters we introduced, really, and when they escape from the spaceship, they land on a planet and they're picked up by the Jawas, and the Jawas eventually go to Luke's uncle's homestead and sell the robots to Luke's uncle. Therefore, we introduce Luke Skywalker through the robots, whom we already know. And it worked much better. We always do that in post-production. You edit it a variety of different ways, you see what it looks like. We did screen the picture for a group of friends. It was a terrible mistake, because very few of the visual effects were finished, there was no music. Only Spielberg said he thought it could be a really exciting film. I think he could see into some of the scenes missing. But almost everybody else said it was difficult to follow, they couldn't figure out what was going on. Which friends were the biggest detractors? Kurtz: I can't remember now, actually, I have to look it up. I have some notes about the evening. It wasn't so much that they were detractors, we were asking for comments on something that was very difficult to follow. It's never a good idea to show unfinished material to anyone outside of the working group anyway. I wouldn't recommend it on any picture, whether you have visual effects or not, because there are just so many things that add to the resonance of the film, especially music and sound effects, and certainly visual effects in this case. If you're using animatics, you can sometimes get around not having the visual effects because you have a drawing that kind of substitutes for that. But certainly the soundtrack is critical for a science fiction film, and we didn't have the soundtrack, except for some dialogue, so I don't blame them for scratching their heads. Were there any that considered it to be George's folly? Kurtz: not really. I mean, everybody knew that it was unfinished, and most of the comments were fairly diplomatic about it being difficult to say, but it was slightly depressing to do that. It didn't make any difference anyway, we didn't change much at all, based on that. It came out pretty much the way the script indicated, except for those minor deletions. And overall, it looks like very little was deleted from the film, except for that subplot. Kurtz: yes, actually, that's it. In the later part of the film, there's not much at all except for time trimming. But, there's no actual scenes that are missing. So basically just the Tatooine subplot and what, Jabba the Hutt at the time? Kurtz: yes. The Jabba the Hutt thing was. I've heard different stories. One was that it was never intended to be in the film, that it was just a let's see if we can do this, and replace it later. The other school of thought was, it was always supposed to be there. Kurtz: well, the original idea was that it was supposed to be there. It is in the script. But it was a guy, a human being, this sort of fat guy. Looked a bit like Sydney Greenstreet. And the scene is pretty much, I mean dialogue-wise, it's exactly what you see in the special edition. But it was a person that was there, and we had technical difficulties with the scene. We shot it over 3 times for camera problems, focus problems, and film stock problem, and then abandoned it because we ran out of time. We just said, well, the bulk of the information that comes across in that scene, about Jabba threatening Han Solo and wanting his money and all of that, we could get across in the scene in the cantina, with Greedo. It's basically the same kind of information. So we just added some bits to the Greedo scene to make it a little bit longer that gets across that information, and then jettisoned that other scene. This all happened while we were shooting. It wasn't done in the cutting room. So it was made at the time of shooting, that the decision was basically made that that scene would be excised. Kurtz: yes, because of the focus problems. And it was slightly redundant anyway because some of the information was already in the Greedo scene, so why not make all the information in the Greedo scene and eliminate the Jabba scene altogether? That's what happened. Now as far as the marketing of the film, whose idea was it to market it to the sci-fi and comic convention circuit? Kurtz: we had always thought, from the very beginning before we even started shooting, that it would have to be a word-of-mouth picture, and it would have to go out to the sci-fi people. Charlie Lippincott was our marketing person, for a while there during the marketing of Star Wars, and he had a lot of contacts with the comic people, and we decided to go to the World Con. I can't remember where it was that year. Kansas City, I think, in '76, the year before the film came out. We had just finished shooting in May or June, and we were editing. The World Con was in September. It's over the Labor Day weekend, I guess, the first week in September. So we decided to go. I went to speak to the people with a slide presentation. Mark Hamill went, and Charlie Lippincott went, and we had a little room with a display. We had some costumes, some of Ralph McQuarrie's artwork. That was it, basically. That was to get an initial look at what the picture was like. We were there for 3 or 4 days, and walked around the convention talking to people, just to build up word of mouth as much as we could. And how would you describe the response it received? Kurtz: the response was very positive. Everybody really liked the idea, and they couldn't wait to see the film. So on the strength of that, we went to several other groups and did the same thing in that ensuing period, between that September and the following March. And the comic book came out in February, I think. Yes, February or March. So, we convinced Fox that all of this was worth supporting. We even sold the film to a group of booksellers, because of the novelization from the book convention in April, I think, just before the film opened, really. But it was just another word-of-mouth screening, just to kind of generate some talk about it. All of those things seemed to work quite successfully for the film. We spent a lot of effort on marketing, and we did a lot of it ourselves. Fox supported some of it. In other parts of it they were less inclined to, because they didn't normally do things like that. In the end, it all proved to be quite useful. What was Fox's general feeling about the film, just prior to its release? Kurtz: well, by that time, they thought it played well for the audience. Laddie and 3 or 4 of the Fox executives, marketing people and some of the distribution people, came up to San Francisco when we ran the film at a preview screening on a Sunday morning at the North Point Cinema in San Francisco for a very wide cross-section demographic of people. Everything from 5-year-old kids to 60, 70-year-old retired people and everything in between. It played quite well. We had preview cards, but they were a waste of time, really. I don't think preview cards ever work really well, anyway. I think you are asking people to codify and make intellectual and emotional response. So they either agonize it over a long time or they come up with the weirdest comments. Just to come up with comments? Kurtz: just to come up with something. Whereas if you just sit and listen to the audience during the screening, you get a pretty good idea of whether they like it or not and what they're responding to. You can tell if scenes are slow, if they get restless. You can tell if things work well. When we had a screening like this for American Graffiti, we found that we weren't leaving enough time in some cases after jokes, because the laughter would carry over and block out dialogue that the audience missed. So we had to actually lengthen a few, not many, but about 3 or 4 shots, so that the dialogue didn't get missed in the cinema. And that's something you really don't know unless you play it for a fairly large audience. We didn't have that kind of problem with Star Wars, but it's very easy with an audience reaction to get a feeling for how they're reacting to each of the scenes, and seeing whether they're playing as you intended. So overall, you're very much a proponent of screenings for an audience. Kurtz: Oh yes. I think word-of-mouth screenings are critical, even if you're not looking for feedback on how the film plays. If all you want to do is get people talking about it, I think it's well worth it. Continue on to the fourth part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz, in which Kurtz discusses George Lucas' original plans for Star Wars prequels and sequels, how the later SW movies differ from the first two films, Kurtz's work on Empire Strikes Back and The Dark Crystal, and more. This is the fourth part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz. To access previous installments, use the above navigation links. I have to ask, at the point which Star Wars was finished, was it always George's intention that his next film, should Star Wars be a success, or should he make another film after that? Was it always going to be a sequel, or did he have other plans? Kurtz: No, originally we were going to do Apocalypse Now, as I said before, after Star Wars. At the very tail end of the shooting of Star Wars, when Laddie had seen more of the footage, they started to come back with saying, well, how much would it be to maybe save these sets or shoot part of another movie and make a sequel which could be done kind of on the cheap? And we said there was no way we could do that, because we didn't have a script, and there was no time to write a script, and anyway it would probably be quite different, and if they wanted a sequel we had to do it properly. The idea kind of faded away at that time, because we were just interested in getting the film made. When it opened, and it was quite popular, the idea of doing a sequel came back. So immediately, the idea was, alright, let's sit down, find a writer, and do a proper job on this treatment material and add notes and things that we already had extracted from the first time around. Because George originally wrote a lot of different, well, you've probably read some of the different versions of the screenplay. The story shifted back and forth a great deal. But in some original notes that were actually before the treatment, before the first screenplay, there was a lot more material, a lot more convoluted story structure and stuff about the long history. In the end, we opted to pick what we thought was a good, rousing adventure story out of the middle of all this material. That's why, in a way, Star Wars looks like it's, as a lot of people said, Chapter 10 of the Flash Gordon serial. So doing a sequel was fairly easy to structure out, and then it became clear that Fox wanted it right away. The idea was to abandon the idea of doing Apocalypse until after the sequel of Star Wars was done. At the time that the screenplay was finished on Empire, it was clear that they wanted to do two sequels, and sort of planned for that. Not to shoot at the same time, it might have been actually better to do that, but in the long run it was better to finish the second one than plan for the third one. But we kept a lot of props, some set pieces and things, design things, around the idea of being able to use them for two films. Now, also the story has arisen that George had always intended prequels, but had never intended sequels to that initial 3 films. Kurtz: After this idea of more films came up, he did several interviews where he said he had story material to do 9 films, 3 prequels and 3 sequels. That was the accepted story, basically, and there was quite a bit of material both before and after the Star Wars lump. So there was no decision to do either one. It was kind of a red herring in a way, because there was no immediate thought to make any other films right away. In a sense, through a business point of view, it probably would have been better to do so, like they did with Star Trek, rather than wait all this time, because the audience interest dissipated somewhat. I mean, it didn't seem to affect the box office on Phantom Menace too much, but it didn't exactly leave a good taste in people's mouths, either. Kurtz: Well, regardless of the value of the film as a film, artistically, there is a kind of energy around some things where if it had come out say 3, 4 years later after Jedi, and then another one 3 or 4 years later after that, that kind of cycle would have probably been better for the audience and for the merchandising than what happened. But that's hindsight. At that time, He always said that he had enough material for 3 earlier films and 3 later films, to make a total of 9, and there were outline materials certainly for later 3 that culminated with this big clash with the Emperor in Episode 9. So, we'll never see any of those, based on what he said now. Well, what were the original outlines for the prequels? Since they can be compared and contrasted now that the first one's out there, and the second one soon to be out there. Were there major differences from what you saw, from the original outlines of prequel ideas? Kurtz: well, a lot of the prequel ideas were very, very vague. It's really difficult to say. I can't remember much about that at all, except dealing with the Clone Wars and the formation of the Jedi Knights in the first place. That was supposed to be one of the keys of Episode I, was going to be how the Jedi Knights came to be. But all of those notes were abandoned completely. One of the reasons Jedi came out the way it did was because the story outline of how Jedi was going to be seemed to get tossed out, and one of the reasons I was really unhappy was the fact that all of the carefully constructed story structure of characters and things that we did in Empire was going to carry over into Jedi. The resolution of that film was going to be quite bittersweet, with Han Solo being killed, and the princess having to take over as queen of what remained of her people, leaving everybody else. In effect, Luke was left on his own. None of that happened, of course. So it would have been less of a fairy tale ending? Kurtz: much, much less. It would have been quite sad, and poignant and upbeat at the same time, because they would have won a battle. But the idea of another attack on another Death Star wasn't there at all. It was a rehash of Star Wars, with better visual effects. And there were no hooks. It was just entirely different. It was much more adult and straightforward, the story. This idea that the roller coaster ride was all the audience was interested in, and the story doesn't have to be very adult or interesting, seemed to come up because of what happened with Raiders of the Lost Ark and the Indiana Jones films, and the fact that that seemed to make a lot of money and it didn't matter whether there was a really good story or not. That wasn't what this kind of film was about. We had serious differences about a lot of that. Well, it's ironic to me. I was talking to somebody who has a lot of good friends at ILM, especially in the conceptual department, and he said that George has basically a new catchphrase in the development process. His new catchphrase is "it's good enough," and they say he uses it all the time now. When you're talking about that idea of only going to a certain depth because the audience only wants the quick and easy impact, and then move along. That somehow the audience isn't observant, so why should we be overly detailed? It's just fascinating to compare that with the observations you made. Kurtz: well, there is a balance that has to be struck there, because if you want to go to the other extreme, as we were talking about with Stanley Kubrick, who was very, very aware and almost paranoid of every detail of his films, it didn't always make any difference in the sense that, as I said, his later films weren't very good, I didn't think. You can go overboard on it and spend too much energy. I think you have to make the film for yourself as the primary audience, and also look at it with a fairly discerning eye. This works for me, this is good, I like this. Yes, there are a lot of things that you can get away with. Roger Corman taught me a lot about things being good enough. When you've used that phrase, good enough usually means it is working for the audience. If it worked for the audience to throw the model through the frame to have the emotional impact that you need, then you do it that way, because it's the cheapest, simplest option. You're not doing it necessarily because it's the cheapest option, but if it works and it only takes 15 minutes, then you have time to work on other things. The catchphrase there is if it works for the audience. It isn't what the cost is. If it doesn't work for the audience, then it doesn't matter how much time and energy you take on it. Look at Pearl Harbor and you get a good example of that. There's a lot of brilliant effects shots in there that don't mean anything. So you have to look at, I think, the emotional response of the audience to the characters as the crucial thing. Visual effects are nothing, they're just a way of helping you tell your story. The fact that they're easier to do now than they ever were before is advantageous to filmmakers, but it doesn't mean you want to use more, or that you want to use them when they're not appropriate. You still have to use the same judgment that we always used, going way back to D.W. Griffith's time. You do what you think works for the story, And if that's elaborate and expensive with thousands of extras like the Mill did in the Ten Commandments, fine, that's what you do. If it's not, if you've got 2 people in the room, then that's fine. It's whatever sells the scene. What is the emotional heart of the scene is the key question always, and how do you sell that visually? If it does require a lot of action to do that, then you have to explore how best to do that action. But it doesn't always, and sometimes you can do it in a very, very simple way. There definitely is a balance there, because there is no perfect. There's never going to be a perfect way to do a scene. More extras, or more visual effects, or more explosions doesn't necessarily mean that it's better. When you talk about the development of Star Wars and the transition in tone through Empire and Return of the Jedi and now eventually what happened with Episode I, do you think that George's storytelling became more simplistic, or less mature? How would you characterize the elements that you saw emerging with the difficulties that were happening towards the end of Empire and what eventually led to Return of the Jedi? Kurtz: I think it became simpler. You don't need complicated interpersonal relationships. You don't need difficult dramatic structures for this kind of story. Empire, in a way, is a typical second act of a 3-act play. It's the problem act. Everybody has problems, everybody has difficulties that they're trying to get out of, and usually the end of the second act is you're leaving everybody in deep shit. And, in a sense, Empire does that. Luke's hand is cut off, and Han Solo is frozen and he's off somewhere. All of the key elements are left unresolved. It's very rare that you see a feature film that ends that way and is satisfactory. We were a bit afraid of that whole concept. Knowing that there was going to be a third film obviously helped, but still, that wasn't going to be for another 3 years, so the idea of presenting this to an audience and having them accept it was a scary proposition. I had never done it before. It seemed to work, though. It seemed to work quite well. The audience was very satisfied, and anticipated the next part. I think part of the reason that they were satisfied was because they were satisfied with the characters themselves. The characters seemed believable in the story. Star Wars, the first film, is very much a comic book story. It's a very archetypal standard story about a hero coming of age and engaging with the world and trying to right some wrongs, and all of those things worked very, very effectively. But the dialogue is fairly pedestrian as far as movies go, and the adventure is carried along by interesting sidebars and some of the individual effects. And the fact that it's kind of a roller coaster ride in a sense, with very, very archetypal energy, so that you can associate with the key character elements very, very easily. There's a lot of undercurrent in Star Wars that, if you take it on the surface, a 4-year-old can really enjoy it, but there's a lot else going on under there. In that sense it's multi-layered, and Empire is as well. That's the thing that bothered me a bit about Jedi and certainly about Episode I, is that those layers, those subtexts, they're all gone. They're not there. You accept what's there on the screen, it either works for you as a surface adventure, or it doesn't. But that's all there is. There's nothing to ponder. No depth. Kurtz: there's no depth in it. And that's where I think the mistake is. And I'm sorry that it happened that way, because the potential for a lot of that is great. It could have had a lot of depth, without damaging the surface story. The sign of a good movie is one that can work on very, very many levels and, depending on your mood when you go to see it, you can see those, or not, as you want. But it doesn't interfere with your entertainment of it. How did you observe that change in George? Because obviously he was the one who guided it towards that lack of depth. Kurtz: well, I think that he felt Empire was an ordeal for him, using his own money. It went over budget and over schedule a bit. Kirshner was slow. We had some problems with Mark Hamill who had an injury, typical movie stuff, really. But even though it did cost a little more than was budgeted, there was no way it was ever going to lose money. He really didn't have to worry too much about it. The combination of the merchandising and the distribution would never be a problem. It was never George's intention to direct Empire? Kurtz: no. After Star Wars, he didn't really want to direct the others. I think he was unhappy that I'm the one that recommended Kirshner, and had worked with him before. I think he was a good choice for Empire. I think he worked really well, but he wasn't the kind of director. George, I think, had in the back of his mind that the director was a sort of stand-in, that he could phone him up every night and tell him what to do and kind of direct vicariously over the telephone. That never happened. Kirshner's not that kind of director, and even when George showed up a couple of times on the set, he found that it wasn't easy to maneuver Kirshner into doing what he would have done. So, on Jedi, he was determined to find a director who was easy to control, basically, and he did. And that was the result, basically. The film was sort of one that George might have directed if he had directed it himself. But maybe not, because it goes through so many interim bits, that if he had directed it probably would have been quite different. For better or worse? Kurtz, I think probably for better. But, I don't know, because as I said, he had gotten into this mode of saying that the audience is interested in the roller coaster ride and that he could make just as much money, and it doesn't have to be complicated, doesn't have to have as difficult a story. There are a lot of other people who do that all the time, that's their kind of movie-making philosophy, the sort of Jerry Bruckheimer approach to movies. A lot of Hollywood movies have been based on the idea that the story is the subtext of the action, so that's certainly nothing new. But it's not very satisfying, I don't think, personally. But, you can make a lot of money, and if that's what you want to do, then you do it that way. How did the arguments between you and George escalate during Empire? Kurtz, it was just a matter of trying to get done and he, I suppose, wasn't very good at delegating. Sometimes he would want to control everything, and then other times he would go away and you wouldn't hear from him for a long time. It was difficult to fathom kind of how he approached all that, and he comes out of school doing everything himself, the documentary school where he wrote and directed and shot and edited all by himself, and there's certain feature films you can make that way, and others you can't. He had a good eye, and he's a very good editor, and the films that he directed for the most part have a good visual sense. With story material, some of the characters were complicated, and the scripts work well. He seemed to work best as a collaborative writer, where other writers came in and had some say in adding certain things so you'd get a variety of point of view, like Willard and Gloria Hike on American Graffiti. The Hikes also did a polished last draft on Star Wars to add some humor and some edginess to some certain bits, and I think it helped a lot. Would you say that George tends to be a cold writer, as far as emotional warmth or character depth? We were talking about this as far as American Graffiti, that everything tended to be somewhat sterile as far as George's original drafts of that film. Kurtz, I think that's probably the case. The other writers tended to add extra elements, especially emotional elements. George tends to write about the facts, in effect. Very documentarian. Kurtz, yes, because that's his background. At what point did you decide to divorce yourself from the Star Wars process? Kurtz, well, it was just the difficulties of finishing Empire, and the fact that, at the very beginning with American Graffiti and with Star Wars, and into the start of Empire, it was a very, very small shop. There were 4 or 5 of us in the office, and that was it. Then, in the middle of Empire, we were here in England shooting and George was back in San Francisco working with ILM on visual effects and other things, too. He hired some film people from other companies and started to expand into a much bigger operation. Some marketing people, and some merchandising, and people to negotiate in some of the toy deals. And by the end of Empire, it turned into kind of this big organization. Not big necessarily in terms of actual physical numbers, there weren't that many people, but there were enough, and it was an entirely different attitude about everything. That was part of it, and also the fact that I think he blamed me for all the things that were difficult on Empire, a director that was difficult to control, a film that was too expensive, and all those things. Do you think that he felt he'd outgrown the need for a set of controls? No, man. Kurtz, I don't know. I don't think we ever talked about it in those terms, but I think that he did chafe a bit under the idea of someone saying that's not a good idea, some of the time. At the very end of Empire. We decided at the very last minute, We pretty much locked the picture in the mix and just getting ready to make 70mm prints, and we decided that there had to an extra shot at the very end, to identify this rebel fleet. If you remember how the end works, it's before you go into the medical department, who are working on Mark's hand. It's the establishing shot of the fleet, and we had a shot already of going into the window and showing Mark inside, and we just decided that it was confusing. We didn't know exactly how that was sorted out, so we wanted a long shot at the beginning, and then one at the end that shows the whole fleet when the Falcon flies off. They weren't very difficult to do, and all the ships were there. Just pile up the composites, and they were rushed through, just to get it done. Very last minute. One of them wasn't particularly good, and George said, "Oh well, maybe we should just let it go." I said, "It's worth at least one more go through. One bad shot can ruin the whole movie, basically." Which I really believe is true, and it just wasn't very good. It was just a compositing problem, had nothing to do with the individual shot elements. I can't even remember what shot it was, now. I think making a movie wears everybody down. You have to be really careful of the decisions you make at the very end, because you can kind of throw a monkey wrench in, very easily. Just to get it out the door? Kurtz, yeah, just to get it done. So, I really don't want to criticize any way of making movies. Anybody makes a decision about what they want to make, and they make it, and it goes out there, and the audience is there or it isn't. You can argue for years about the Pauline Kael approach, about whether movies are art or commerce or how much intellectual content you have. One of the things I remember Pauline Kael said quite clearly is that, the young filmmakers of the 70s mostly didn't have anything to say. They were good technicians and they knew all the tricks, but they didn't have any passions, like some of the filmmakers in the 20s, 30s and 40s did. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't generally believe in vague generalizations, but there is a certain amount of truth to that, because a lot of films that have come out since the 70s have been quite shallow. Good-looking films, but not much to say. Maybe that's part of the problem, the filmmakers haven't lived enough. Their entire experience is based on old movies, rather than life. As such, they're referential all the time, referential to old movies rather than to life experience. So I suppose the only answer to that is material that isn't that way, material that's written by novelists or screenwriters that have a substantial amount of real-life experience and have interesting things to say about various topics. Anyway, as it relates to Star Wars, the key is that the original Star Wars, and to a great extent Empire, resonated with the audience because there seemed to be something there that appealed to them. Saying something to them that they may not have even noticed. It was subconscious and they wanted to see it, they wanted to be immersed in that experience, to be able to see it several times. That's one of the reasons the films were so popular. If you think about the fact that Star Wars came out so long ago, when ticket prices were that much cheaper, the reason it made as much money as it did is because people went back to see it many times. There are some infamous stories about people seeing it about 200 or 300 times. I'm not sure if that's true or not. A scary thought. Kurtz. It is a scary thought. But even seeing it 5 times was unusual at the time, and there are films that make a lot of money with the audience seeing it only once, because there's a big audience and the ticket prices are so much higher. There are lots of films that have come out down through the entire history of film that people do see over and over again, because they're nourishing films and they resonate strongly, story-wise, with the audience. I like to think that Star Wars and Empire are that kind of film. They fit into that way of looking at films. Nourishing. I don't know that you can always put your finger on what it is. It's very easy for the film critics to analyze why a film is popular or why a film is good, but in the long run, it's very, very subjective. You get 6 people in a room, you are going to get 6 different opinions about any film, and they're all right. There's no wrong. I've never wanted to look upon the idea that Knights of Cabiria and The Seventh Seal are great classics, and The Sting and Jaws aren't because they're Hollywood adventure movies. You can make a case for any kind of movie that appeals to you. I mean, the bottom line is always Kurtz: If you enjoy what you're seeing, and you get something out of it. Ign. Then it's great art to you. Kurtz. Then it's working for you. Whether or not it will last, whether or not 30 years down the road you can still watch a film and say, yes, I like that. Like you can with Sullivan's Travels, or Citizen Kane, or dozens of other films from the 30s and a lot of the other 30s films, in fact the majority probably. 90% are films that you wouldn't want to watch again. I think that applies to books and theater and everything created, paintings even, music. A little bit of it is going to float to the surface and be around in 30, 40 years, and the rest is not. Ign. Which can be said of any time period and, as you said, any genre. Kurtz. Yeah, it applies to everything across the board. Ign. Would you say, in trying to transition out of Star Wars, that your departure was acrimonious? Kurtz. No. I think it was. I think we both were frustrated and decided we just didn't want to work together anymore for the time being. Also, I had for a long time wanted to work again with Jim Henson, and he wanted me to do The Dark Crystal with him, and it was an entirely different kind of challenge. One of the problems at that particular moment was it looked to me like Jedi was going to be disappointing, with the change in the story, with all of the story material that I had really resonated with being tossed out, and that whole Hooks thing, and the new Death Star and the same kind of climax of Star Wars. It was, from a creative challenge point of view, kind of a rehash. So the idea of doing something like Dark Crystal, a whole film made up of mechanical creatures with very little in the way of optical effects, trying to make that come to life was an entirely different kind of challenge. That was much more appealing to me. Ign. So it was a mutual. Kurtz. It was pretty much a mutual thing, yeah. Ign. How would you characterize your relationship with George now? Kurtz. I think it's pretty normal. He is very busy, and a very reclusive character, but I talk to him once in a while. I saw him at the special edition premiere here in London and I've seen him a few times. We both went and spoke at this 25th anniversary screening of American Graffiti at the Motion Picture Academy. I've talked to him on the phone a couple of times, not very often, because it doesn't seem to come up. Ign. He doesn't solicit advice? Kurtz. Number. Ign. And, overall, your opinion on episode I would be? Kurtz. Well, I don't know that I'm a very impartial observer. As I said, I knew what some of the history was about and what it could have been in terms of way back when we were talking about it, so in that sense just going to see the film and seeing the way it turned out was a disappointment because of my built-in connection to all of that past. That's not fair for the film, because the film isn't that film, or it isn't one of the ones that we talked about, it's a different film, with a different script. But I think I'm objective enough to say that even given that parameter and given the script that they ended up with, I felt it was very, very weak. It isn't very dramatic and I was very bored in watching it. There were no surprises. Nothing that was unexpected, and there wasn't anything that I was looking forward to. I was quite disappointed, actually. I had a long discussion after that first time I saw it, because I saw it at the opening weekend when I was at a Star Wars science fiction convention in Dallas, Texas, the big one. There were about 8,000 people. The next day, lots of people asked me about it, and I said, well, I'm not the one really to ask about it. You either like it or you don't. In talking to smaller groups, and some of the people I was with, it felt to me like the dramatic potential of the story and the way the story went wasn't handled as well as it might have been, and that's always a very subjective thing. There are lots of ways you can do it. Any 10 filmmakers would have taken the same script and made it 10 different ways. I'm not sure how valid that kind of criticism is. In the end, it's what you like or don't like. As I said before, there's no good or bad or right or wrong. So to say you don't like something is perfectly valid. To say it isn't great, because I would have made it better, is not so valid. Ign. But as far as tendencies go, you could definitely say that, with his emerging tendencies that you witnessed firsthand, this is a film that George would have made. Kurtz. Well, it seems that way, and I am just hoping that the next one is more sure-footed and better dramatically, and more interesting. I would love it to be. On the other hand, it feels like, From things that I've heard and what people have written about, that the money from the toys and the merchandising was so much more than from the film that you could very easily fall into this trap that it doesn't make any difference what's in the film as long as it has lots of referential material and it comes out and it's finished. Then, even if the film goes right in the toilet and doesn't even make any money, you'll make all the money on toys. Well, that's obviously not true, because if you have a total turkey, then you're not going to sell toys, but how many book companies, what was the book company, was in the UK, that went out of business because of episode I? Kurtz, almost went out of business, yeah. A lot of the toys didn't sell. A lot of the collectors who collect this kind of merchandise. Collectors are the ultimate junkies, they have to buy every box, every packaging of every toy so they have a full collection, and even they didn't buy a lot of the stuff. I think that there's an energy around collecting and it didn't happen with this. Maybe the next one it will. It never was there before Star Wars, either. Movie merchandise was really a problematic thing. Occasionally you would have some success, and most of the time you wouldn't, and there never was any real answer for that. How annoyed are you to always get asked these Star Wars questions? Kurtz, well, it does get a bit much after a while. Occasionally I do a convention for friends in Holland and Scandinavia and they'll have Star Wars fan clubs and things, and I'll go talk to them. It is very interesting that the films generate so many dyed-in-the-wool fans, still, after all this time. And it's very easy to look upon groups like this, and you say, Jesus, why don't you guys get a whole life? But, as I said before, there's a resonance there. There's a kind of archetypal energy that surrounds the original films, especially the first two, that people have gotten a lot out of. That is actually what real fandom comes from. The Star Trek television series and the films have some of that, too. Some are a lot better than others, but you associate with something like that because you feel you've gotten something out of it and you want to talk to other people that have as well. There isn't anything wrong at all with that kind of fandom, I don't think. It's a bit like Galaxy Quest. Did you see Galaxy Quest? Yes. Kurtz, I thought it was a great film, because it pointed out both the kind of idiotic side, and the kind of really sincere side of what fandom is all about. All while being a good film. Kurtz, yes, at the same time, which is a good feat. I think for me, one of the problems with episode I was that it didn't have any humor to speak of. Well, at least not anything above a 5-year-old level. Kurtz, yeah. And I just wish there were enough tangential things, enough sidebars that there was a subtext going on sometimes, rather than just what's on the surface. There are a lot of movies that are made on the what you see is what you get approach to movie making. A lot of them have done really well, but I'm not a fan, generally, of those kind of movies. So I'm probably not the best one to comment. I thought The Mummy Returns was awful. I thought Lara Croft was awful. I would agree with both of those. Kurtz, they're awful. It's not because they're not well made, they actually are well made, from a physical production point of view, it's because the scripts are incredibly weak and the actors have nothing to do. There was an air of desperation in both of them. Kurtz, yeah. I actually kept looking in Mummy Returns to see where they stashed the kitchen sink, because I knew it must be in there somewhere. But now on to Dark Crystal. You had said, working with Jim again. Had you worked with Jim previously? Kurtz, I had worked with him briefly in early Sesame Street days and the Muppet Show era. Not much really, just in some character stuff and then also because of my past association with him and loving puppets anyway. I brought Jim and his creatures up into Empire to help design and fabricate and do Yoda. When we were designing Yoda, we knew it had to be done hand puppet style. We had talked about a lot of different things, on Empire, about doing it as a drawn creature or 3D graphics creature or come up with a lot of off-the-wall ideas, and rejected them all for the idea that if it's a character that's there, on the set, that we can photograph at the same time, then the actors can interact. Basically. The great fear was that he wouldn't look real enough, he wouldn't work well enough. But I think it worked out very well, and we had 3 operators and we rehearsed everything very extensively. It was a very slow process, But it did work. Jim was already working on the characters for the Dark Crystal. He had been for a year. He had people working on Dark Crystal characters 3 years before, when I saw him in New York just when Star Wars opened. The idea for the Dark Crystal was that the entire film would be full of these characters and they would interact with each other on the real stage, and how many other puppeteers we would have to make them work would be what would be required. In most cases, of the big characters, it was 3, sometimes 4. When you had lots of big characters on the screen at the same time, like the scenes with the Skeksis and the Uru together, there were 14 characters on the stage, and that meant, like, 21 puppeteers hiding somewhere. Just a logistical nightmare that must have been. As a producer on that film, what exactly did your duties entail? Kurtz, since Jim and Frank Oz were both directing, it was primarily making it happen. Really? I told some film students. They were asking about what the definition of a producer was, and I said, you know, in today's films, you probably have 15 producer credits. Lots of executive producers and associate producers and co-producers and all that. Most of these people helped get the financing together to make it possible for the film to happen. As such, they probably deserve some kind of credit, whether it should be a producer's credit or not, I would argue with it. But they did help get the resources together to make it possible. But the producer's job is to actually make the film happen. To assist the director in whatever is necessary. To shield them from having to deal with anything aside from having to work with the performers when they're shooting. That's what I did on the Dark Crystal, work out the organizational plan. The Creature Shop was notoriously lax at meeting time deadlines. They were very, very creative, but their people didn't work to any particular time deadlines. They would work 18 hours at a stretch, and then disappear for 3 days, sleeping. You know, that kind of thing. So we had to have a slightly more formal organizational structure for the shop to get all these characters done. It wasn't just the main characters, there were hundreds of incidental little characters. Trees and plants and little creatures and things in the jungle and the woods. The film was full of all kinds of background stuff that you probably don't even notice most of the time. I know that, in talking to Frank Oz, he had mentioned that he was very insecure on that film. In fact, I think his quote was, "Jim should have effing fired me numerous times." How did that manifest itself to you? Kurtz, I would never recommend co-directing, really. I think the problem isn't that the people don't see the same vision, it's that it's very difficult to judge what's right for the moment. There was a lot of time spent sitting and discussing, not so much arguing. Neither Jim nor Frank has a personality that is a screamer. The discussions were very measured. But there still were a lot of differences of opinion about how things should be, even when we were working on script revisions and looking at how to cut things down in other aspects of it. With the dual directing thing, it made it quite difficult. It ended up being that a lot of the time when Frank was principal performer, that Jim would just direct, and Frank wouldn't say anything. We might have a discussion beforehand, but when they were actually shooting, Jim would just direct. In those cases where Jim was the principal performer, Frank would direct and Jim wouldn't say anything. It sort of developed into that kind of scenario, informally. It wasn't something that we sat down and said, this is the structure that it will have to be. It just happened. How did that affect you as a producer? Was it basically a meeting of 3 when you discussed things? Kurtz, pretty much, yes. I was trying to kind of hold everything together. We worked very slowly. One of the problems with the 2 directing business was that there were endless discussions on the set in the beginning, in the first few weeks. I kept telling them that we'd never meet our deadlines this way, and in the end, I ended up being the second unit director myself. I ended up shooting all the action unit stuff, the backlight stuff, the fight between the Gartham and the Landstriders, and all that kind of stuff. Just out of necessity? Kurtz, out of necessity, because they were still shooting away on interiors and things. It was fun, and it was nice to be able to do it, but it was just trying to speed us up a bit and get us done in time. It was definitely never going to be a blockbuster kind of movie, it was a very, very specialized kind of story and type of film from the very beginning, We just had to try to make it as accessible as possible. I mean, the first test screening we had of the film, in Washington, D.C., we still had the Skeksis speaking in a funny foreign language which we had created out of ancient Egyptian. And without subtitles, I must say. With the idea, which was very much an intellectual conceit that we all had, I'm afraid, that we didn't have to have any subtitles because the scenes that they're in are so obvious. That what they're saying to each other is so obvious. That the audience will get it. What happened from the preview cards and other people we talked to, yes, the audience did get what the key to scene was, but they weren't sure they did. They were always worried they were missing something. So they spent too much time trying to analyze, instead of watching the film? Kurtz, yep, so we gave up on that and decided they had to speak English. We didn't want to subtitle a third of the movie, that was big, so we had them speak English. Continue on to the conclusion of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz, in which Kurtz discusses Jim Henson's hopes for the Dark Crystal, the making of Return to Oz, the special editions of Star Wars, Kurtz's return to producing, and more. This is the fifth part of Ken's conversation with Gary Kurtz. To access previous installments, use the above navigation links. What exactly was Jim's hope for the film? Kurtz, he wanted it to be a kind of classic fantasy. If the rights had been available, he would have probably wanted to make Lord of the Rings. It had already been destroyed by Ralph Bakshi and his aborted animated version, so that wasn't possible. Kind of the next best thing was to create your own, and Brian Froud was a really good designer and creator of a kind of fantasy world that was extremely unique. It would have never been done before. There had never been a film made with all mechanical characters. There had been films that had mechanical characters in them, but they always had humans in them. Now, in retrospect, and at the time we had a long discussion about it, it probably would have been better if Jen and Kira, the most human-like elfin characters, had been human beings. We did talk about it, but Jim was so set on having it be an all-mechanical character film, that colored his opinion about that. Dramatically, it probably would have been better if those two had been humans, because we would have gotten much more emotional resonance out of those characters. The other characters, which were all very strange and non-human, were fine the way they were, and the emotionalism seemed to be there. But those two, their faces were quite difficult to get any strong, emotional reaction out of. Where did the money come from for the film? Kurtz, the money for the Dark Crystal came from Lou Grade's company. Right at the very end before the film was released, Lou Grade's company folded up. It was bought out because he had had so many disastrous movie problems. The last 3 or 4 films went to Universal to distribute, which wasn't a great idea, because Universal really didn't want them, but that was just part of this deal. They didn't have much hope for the Dark Crystal at all in America. They just said there's no audience for this film, it probably won't make $1 million. In the end, it did very well, considering the kind of marketing they put behind it. It did 45–50 million in a very specialized market. We were all very pleased. I suppose the sad and somewhat ironic thing about Lou Grade's company was that the last 2 films, The Dark Crystal and On Golden Pond, the Jane Fonda, Henry Fonda film, did very well. If he had held out a little longer, he might not have had to sell the company, but you never know in those kind of things. So, transitioning out of Dark Crystal, what was the next project that you set your sights on? Kurtz, well, I had been working on several scripts. A friend of mine, Walter Merck, had done a version of an Oz story, and he wanted to do a kind of Return to the Wizard of Oz kind of story, and we talked about it at great length. Disney was interested seriously in doing it, so we said, well, it's a chance to do something, a really interesting fantasy. It was quite a difficult situation, actually, because by the time we got into production, Disney was in serious trouble in the mid-80s and they stopped the project 2 or 3 times. The management changed 3 major times. By the time the film was finished and ready to be released, the Eisner-Katzenberg regime was in and they didn't really want to know anything about the project. They just wanted to bury it in 3 other films made by the previous regime. Which is very demoralizing, and yet they did eventually release it, but without putting very much behind it, and it didn't do very well theatrically. It was one of those films that was very difficult to market. The artwork and things marketed it as if it was sort of a bright and bubbly sequel to Wizard of Oz. That's what the audience expected. It wasn't that at all. It was quite dark, actually. I don't know if you've seen it. Yes. Oh yes. It disturbed me as a child, but I have grown to appreciate it. Kurtz, it didn't satisfy any of the audiences, and I suppose a really astute marketing person would have told us to stay away from the L. Frank Baum Oz stories, because The Wizard of Oz set the tone for the audience's perception about Oz. Although The Wizard of Oz as a film was nothing like the original book, that's what people expected. So, when this film, which was an amalgamation of the second and third books, really, lumped together, came along, it was much more like L. Frank Baum's novels. But the audience that loved The Wizard of Oz didn't like it, because it wasn't a bright and bubbly musical. We had a kind of no-win situation, in a way, unless it had been marketed very, very carefully, which it wasn't. It was a very, very frustrating thing for me, and it drove me away from Hollywood. I just didn't want to have anything more to do with Hollywood companies for a long time after that. I just said, I just cannot put up with this anymore, and so I didn't. I went away, actually. I was living in England anyway during this time and just flying back and forth as necessary, but still it was kind of the last straw for me. I just didn't see it as possible to work in that environment and be satisfied. I knew a lot of other people who were, and that was fine for them, but I just couldn't handle it. Partially, it was that whole thing. Twice during the picture they tried to fire Walter. He was difficult as a director, because he's a wonderful editor but he's not very spontaneous. He plans things out very meticulously, which is what editors do best. As a director, you have to be pretty spontaneous, because if your plan doesn't quite work, you don't flog it to death, you try something else. It requires flexibility. Kurtz, yeah, a lot of flexibility, and he didn't have a whole lot. It was his first film as a director, and we were all trying to help him as much as possible, but he had a clear vision in his head of what he saw, and if it wasn't working, he didn't have much to fall back on in terms of spontaneity. It was tricky. In the end, to keep him from being fired, I ended up having to bring in reinforcements, in a way. I got Francis and George to come over and talk to him, and then talk to the studio and say it'll be okay, and he'll be fine. In effect, it was just buying time, really, so we could finish the shooting. Because he didn't do anything differently. They were just worried because it was a bit behind. It wasn't really over budget or anything, it was just a bit behind schedule and they were worried about him as a first-time director anyway. Because the management changed so often, though, it was really difficult to get into a rapport with anybody at the studio. Which was harder for you, or for him? Kurtz, he didn't have to deal with it a whole lot, and so it was probably harder for me. But they canceled the picture a couple of times. They insisted that they put another guy on, as sort of a co-producer, Paul Maslansky, who had made a lot of low-budget films, and was a good, experienced production type. And he was fine. We got along with him fine. It was just a concern about the picture kind of going out of control, and the truth is that the Eisner-Katzenberg regime, when they came in, probably would have cancelled the picture if they could have, but we were almost finished shooting then. It was too late, really. At least it can be said that the film has found an aftermarket. Kurtz, yes. Yes it has. For years and years and years you couldn't buy it on video or DVD or anything. They never re-released it like they did their other films. I had a laserdisc of it that was in Japan that Disney put out in Japan only. But I see now that they actually have put out a video of it. I think it's a special edition, even. Kurtz, yeah. I think it did have some critical response that was positive to it. Kurtz, oh yes. There was quite a few. We had an interesting test screening with the National Research Group, where we screened it for a mixed group of parents and children. The parents, I think about 75% of the parents, felt it was way too scary for kids below 12, I think. Some of the kids who were young were a bit scared. But when the research people spoke with the kids, they said they liked it a lot. They had a great time. The parents of those very same kids said they felt that their kids would never want to see anything like this film. I think, what, Harlan Ellison called it the greatest film ever made. Kurtz, Harlan is prone to the superlative, I think. The interesting thing about it is that I show it to film students occasionally because this is a film that's ostensibly a children's film about going into a fantasy world. Yet it is not sentimental, and it is quite scary in a lot of ways, and yet children respond to it. It isn't sappy. One of the criticisms was that it wasn't funnier, it didn't have more humor, but there's a certain amount of strange humor in the whole repartee between Dorothy and Billina, the chicken, constantly throughout the story. But it's not a rip-roaring comedy-type movie. It's a disturbingly dark comedy. Kurtz, yes, it is. I mentioned earlier it's something that it is appreciated more as one gets older. Kurtz, yes, I think it is. A real problem that we had with the film is that it ends about 3 times. We had a very difficult time trying to figure out how to get out. Because of the way the story is structured, we had to come back from Oz to Kansas, and so, even within Oz, there's a couple of endings. Actually, the end of the movie, energetically for the audience and for all practical purposes, is when Dorothy makes the right guess in the trinket room at the end and brings back her friends. And when the Gnome King is overcome, at the very end. Emotionally, that's the end of 1, and the whole business of the big parade and all the Oz characters and the princess and all of that is a coda really. But then we have another coda, of her having to go home. It was really difficult. We knew that that was a problem in the script, and we never did solve it completely. I still don't know how best to have handled that because you can't just dump Dorothy out of the story at that point and take her back to Kansas. Although, technically, comparing it back, the original Wizard of Oz had the same problem. Kurtz, it did, but it worked better in The Wizard of Oz, I think, just because of the way it was handled and the kind of movie that it was. I think that if I were doing Return to Oz now, I would have eliminated a lot of the celebration in Oz and the whole stay here with us, Dorothy, and would have gotten the princess out, and gotten her out quicker somehow. A movie is what it is because that's what happened at the time. That is one of the reasons why I rail against this idea about changing movies all the time. This is a very common practice now, which I really don't like, on any movie. I don't like the special editions of Star Wars and all these other movies that have come out with a super-duper director's cut like the special edition of Close Encounters. You name it. Practically every movie now does it, because they can do it for DVD. The ironic thing of it is that no matter how many times someone protests that no, it was their original intention, any choices they make now are going to be colored by their experiences since they made the film. Kurtz, oh, absolutely. The reason is that there is a whole emotional vortex around how a movie is made, and it captures a certain flavor of the moment. What's a perfect example? The Sweet Smell of Success, Sandy McKendrick's film, made in the mid-50s in New York. It's a very harsh, downbeat, dark, film noir film, terrific film. It's one of my favorite films. If he would have made that film 10 years earlier or 10 years later, it would have been an entirely different movie, even from the same script. So this idea of adding things, the problem with the special edition of the Star Wars films is that fixing a few matte lines and adding a couple of spaceships into shots is fine. I don't think anybody would notice that. But actually adding scenes that don't make any difference, they actually don't have any effect whatsoever on the film. And all of those digitally enhanced shots of robots floating around and creatures walking through the frame, call attention to themselves, are much worse, actually, I think. Primarily because CGI work, and that CGI work was done by ILM, which is the best there is. The CGI stuff does not fit in with the mechanical style of the original film. If the whole film would have been made today, then the CGI work would fit in much more, because that's the way all the visual effects would have been done. Oh, I don't know, in Episode I, the CGI still calls attention to itself. Kurtz, well, it does, yes, that's true. Even though there's lots of it and most of the shots have some kind of CGI, but it's less annoying, I think, and stands out less than it does in the special editions. If you remember the scene when the robots go down to Tatooine, to the desert, and then later you cut back to the stormtroopers looking for them, there's a scene where stormtroopers are sitting up on the hill in the background riding what looks like a giant lizard. In the original, that's a mock-up that we borrowed, rendered from a prop house, and carried all the way out there and stuck it there in the sand. It didn't do anything. There was just a stormtrooper sitting on a giant lizard, a model. It doesn't do anything, it's just in the background and the stormtrooper in the foreground stands up with a piece of the robot and says, "They've been here." That's all the scene is supposed to be for. As it is in the special edition, that stormtrooper on the dinosaur in the background moves, it's all CGI. And it adds nothing whatsoever to the story. Kurtz, I know, and that's what I mean with the proliferation. Just because you can do it, doesn't make it better. But those animals moving actually distract from the principal purpose of the scene. If they had been horses, if it had been a western and those were horses, chances are the horses would have just been sitting there, because horses do that a lot. They don't move much. If they're not running or trotting or something, sometimes they just sit there, and maybe flick their ears a bit, for long periods of time. But they don't do a song and dance number. Kurtz, no, they don't move around at all. They just stand there. If they had made it that subtle, if they had had that creature in the background move its head an inch to the right or something, a blink, that would have been all that you need to do. But it's not necessary at all, because the way it was in the beginning, in the first place, it was that way because that's all we could afford and it worked fine. I'm just not a great believer in messing with what is done. It may not be perfect, and as I said a long time ago, there's nothing that is. No movie is perfect, and every filmmaker is going to sit and watch a movie that he made 10 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, and say, "Oh, I wish I could have done that better." You're the person to ask about this. When you're talking about these kind of special editions and changes and are they due to an original vision or changing sensibilities, I have to ask you about your thoughts regarding the infamous redo of the scene with Greedo in the cantina. The whole shooting first thing. Kurtz, yeah, I really was livid about that one. I think it was it ruins the scene, basically. The scene was never intended that way. Han Solo realized that Greedo was out to get him and he had to blast him first or he would lose his life. It shows you how much of a mercenary he is. That's what the point of the scene was. And so the way they've changed it around, it loses the whole impact of that whole aspect of it. Do you think that's due to George's changing sensibilities as opposed to his argument that, no, that was my original intention? Kurtz, well, he can say that was his original intention, but we could have shot it that way very easily. There was no reason that it couldn't have been shot that way. It was shot and edited the way it was because that's the way the script was. That's what he wanted at the time. What is your opinion of why he would try and rationalize it, when he could very well just say, you know, I just thought nowadays, it's better if he shoots first. Kurtz, maybe he just didn't want to say that. Maybe he felt it was a stronger argument to say, that's what I really wanted to do and I just didn't have time or inclination at the time. You listen to all these directors, they all say that. That's the stock argument. Somehow if they say that, you can't argue with them. I think Apocalypse Now is now, what, 16 hours or something? Kurtz, 16 hours. No, they've added the 50-some-odd minutes back. With the French plantation scene. Kurtz, yeah, it's mostly the French plantation scene. That's probably a mistake, too. It's a disease, basically. I suppose they can do whatever they like, but I just would like to see the original version of everything preserved. When Star Wars comes out on DVD, the only version that's going to be available is the special edition. They're not going to do the original, unless he changes his mind. Which is unfortunate, because that's the perfect medium for it. Kurtz, yeah, the idea is that you could do both. I'm sure you'd have an audience out there that would buy both. Maybe it will be both, who knows. Be interesting to see how that would work, marketing-wise. But I just don't like changing whatever a film is like when it's finished, good, bad, or indifferent. That's the way it was at released and the way the audience perceives it. To keep fiddling with it, long after the fact. Jean Renoir said in a documentary interview that we did with him when we were all film students, that something that he learned from his father was that, for an artist, the most important thing is to know when you're done, and leave it. Of course for a painter, it's absolutely crucial, because you put too much extra paint on and you've ruined the painting. With a filmmaker, you have a certain amount of recourse and you can change it again, but the principle is still the same, to know when you're done, and when it's over, and when it's finished, and you walk away. It's critical, because you can be like Kubrick, and you can work on it forever, and it's still not going to get any better. At least one can say Kubrick didn't go back 25 years later and add a scene to Dr. Strangelove. Kurtz, no, he didn't, or 2001, or any of those early films. He at least accepted that they were finished, and that was it. And wouldn't allow others to tinker with them, either. Kurtz, number, after you divorce yourself from Hollywood, I mean we already discussed Slipstream, what exactly is your mindset after that? Kurtz, well, I went away for a few years, and I've always wanted to do this sort of spiritual quest project that I've written on for a long time, and I went away to spend time on my own personal kind of spiritual studies and growth and studied at Buddhist monasteries and Hindu ashrams and some Roman Catholic monasteries in parts of Europe. Just to kind of study various concepts and talk to people, and I spent a lot of time doing that, and also time talking to film students and contributing to helping other people get things made, and it's only recently that I've decided to do more active things. There are several scripts that I've been funding and getting written, and I've been working with the BBC with some 3D animation stuff for television, for children. I think children's television is really critical. It's just been a lot of fun, really, not having to deal with the Hollywood mess. It's very easy to say, well, things were better in the old days, but I think the movie business goes through cycles, up and down, and the last few years there've been very few really good films. I've been really disappointed. But I'm sure there will be some comeback, and there will be more. Do you ever itch to return to the Hollywood scene? Kurtz, what, do big films? I always enjoyed making films. I think that having the opportunity to do a project is always a wonderful challenge, but most of the things that interest me are smaller, more European-based kind of projects, rather than the sort of big Hollywood kind of movie. That's much more intriguing. More crews and more interesting relationship with a more tight-knit family, the way the European filmmakers have been working all along, really. What led to you getting involved with Patrick Reed Johnson's May 25, 1977? Kurtz, I was involved for a brief period at Universal with developing several projects with Patrick just after Slipstream, none of which happened. That was another nail in the coffin of Hollywood, basically. The studio liked the scripts, but just didn't want to go ahead and make them, and wouldn't allow us to buy them or sell them to anybody else to get made, so it was just one of those things. I liked Patrick's writing a lot, and when he came up with this script, I read it and we talked about it a great deal. It's a really interesting kind of story around this boy's life and this day in his life, and using the Star Wars gimmick of trying to see the screenings and missing them all as a kind of a jumping-off place for his interest in movies. Since he actually had come out to Hollywood and seen ILM in operation on some of the effects shots and visited the Close Encounters set, I thought it could be a really interesting little film. It's very European in style and I just would like to see it get made, so I'm just trying to help get it made. How are things looking, in that respect? Kurtz, a certain amount of the financing is in place, and we've been constantly putting together a cast of various people, and it looks like probably in a little while we'll get all the bits together. One of the decisions is how. It's the kind of film that you could do in the sort of contemporary world, you could shoot it on video and do it for $1 million. That's one way to do it. You could do it in Super 16 for $5 million. And you could do it as a sort of out-and-out art film in 35 for $6, $7 million. We haven't decided yet what the best approach is, but certainly the slightly higher budget approach to give it a little more time, production parameter and production value, is probably the way we will go. Ign. Digital doesn't seem like it would do the story justice. Kurtz: No. Certain kinds of stories you can get away with doing that, but not this one. Ign. I'm assuming since this would be filmed in the States, and that you would be in the States for the few months that it was shooting? Kurtz: Yes, definitely. Outside Chicago, where Patrick grew up. Ign. What other projects do you have currently in the pipeline? I've heard some other Patrick projects that you might have in the pipeline. Kurtz: Yes. He's got a fairly large-scale science fiction project, Star Sailor, which I've always liked, and I think we have an interest from a variety of financing sources to do it, also in Europe probably. There's a science fiction television series that I'm negotiating with the BBC on right now, called Hydra 12, that I think has a lot of potential. Terry Gilliam is going to direct the pilot, the first 2-hour episode. He hasn't seen a script yet, so we're desperately trying to get the script done in time for him to kind of look at it and evaluate it. There's a kind of rock and roll movie, I suppose you'd call it, called Eddie and Jean. It's about Eddie Cochran and Jean Vincent, set in 1959-1960 in their one and only tour of the UK. It's an interesting transition period for rock and roll. People forget that that period was a scary time for rock and roll. There was a lot of, in this country anyway, and to a certain extent in America. It was that transition from the old days to forward-looking, and the songs were about all kinds of things, from kind of typical sappy love songs to kind of weird approaches to music. The characters are very interesting, because the two guys are so different, and yet they were good friends and they supported each other a lot. That's another plan, another project. So they're all in various stages of development. And an animated series for BBC television, which is mainly a children's animated series, which is science fiction as well. And investigating the rights to 2 or 3 other as yet unnameable classic science fiction novels that I'd like to see get made, too. So along that line, we are working with several financing organizations, to kind of put together a fund here without having to go to the Hollywood majors to be able to do some of these kind of things. Ign. Of all the projects, what do you think will most likely be your next one, your next big focus? Kurtz: It's hard to say. It has a lot to do with the balance of elements. Sometimes a project gets delayed because the script needs rework, or you can't get the cast together for the perfect time. It's like juggling. At some point, one of the balls falls out, and that's the one that goes, because all of the elements happen to fall into place. It's very difficult right now, sitting here today, to say, well, it looks like 525's elements will come together first. I think that probably will be the case, but I can't tell absolutely. Ign. So you wouldn't put money on anyone? Kurtz: I wouldn't put money on anyone right now, until I know a little bit more over the next month or so. Ign. Now, as far as your career goes, what do you believe at this point would be your legacy? If anyone were to point at one thing and say, you know, that was the epitome of the kind of work that Gary Kurtz was involved in? Kurtz: Well, gee, that's awfully hard to say. I think that probably of the films that I've produced, every one of them is different, quite different in a way. Somewhat unique. Some were successful financially, and some weren't so successful. But in thinking of the group, I think I can be pretty proud of almost all of them. Tulane, American Graffiti, Star Wars, Empire, Dark Crystal, and Return to Oz have elements that I'm very, very pleased with. I think that we were able to achieve pretty much what we set out to achieve. So except for Slipstream, which came along a bit later and was, in a way, kind of throwaway because it was a favor for a friend, and I didn't absolutely control the project. And as I told you earlier, it was a bit of a mess because of the change in production plan and script, right at the very last minute. But all those others are, I think, given the time frame in which they were made, they were a very good block of films. I think that they all are about characters that, as different as they are, have some interest in seeing their place in the world. I think that's probably, if there's any enduring connection, that's it. Ign. Would you say that right now, you're happy where you are? Kurtz: Oh yes. Yes. I don't think I would change places with anybody, because I'm very pleased with having the experiences that I've had. The fact of the difficulties of Return to Oz, for instance, which kind of forced me to reconsider my life. At the time I was very disappointed about it all, but the truth is that it was a chance to spend a great deal of time focusing on myself and things that I've been interested in, personally. And things that I was interested in general, along the spiritual lines, which have been a big help for me, so I consider it a very positive step. Very karmic for me. Sometimes that's what happens. The road that you take is forced upon you, and you don't like it, but it's the right one anyway. I have one final question for you. What was the genesis of your involvement in the Scrooge McDuck book? Kurtz: Oh yes, Carl Barks. I used to collect comic books and Barks was one of my favorite authors. When everyone else was collecting Superman, I was collecting the Barks Uncle Scrooge books. I had almost a complete collection, then I lost some of them to water damage and some other things. During the Star Wars period, Ed Summer, who ran a comic book shop in New York City, was a friend of mine and I would ask him to see if he could find some of these Barks things. He had conversations with Barks and at that time and he suggested to me that it would be really nice to do a limited edition of Barks stuff that was colored properly, the way it should have been in the beginning, and not edited for the regular comic book. So that was the start. And I said, yes, that is a really good idea. So we sat down and went through our favorites of the old stories and got Peter Ledger from Australia to do the coloring work, the airbrushing and the coloring the way Barks had originally intended it. It was a labor of love, really, and it cost about $300,000 to do it, and there were only 5,000 copies of the book. I used to dream about that book as a kid. Kurtz: It was just a lot of fun, really, because I loved seeing the stories properly colored and in some cases with frames put back that had been left out, originally. Yeah, that's really where it came from, and I had the resources to do it, and it just seemed like kind of an homage to Barks' work, because I had really loved him as a kid. I think he was one of the reasons why I really loved adventure, fantasy, and science fiction movies, because of that whole feeling of other worlds and going off on these grand adventures and things, which his characters did all the time. It's great that you were able to spearhead that effort and actually get that thing put out into the market. It's a shame it's not in print anymore. Kurtz: Yes, it is. It is a shame. Disney was very difficult about that, and we eventually got over that difficulty, but when it came up time to reprint it again, the administration had changed, and they didn't want to be bothered, really. Although it wouldn't have cost them anything and they would have had a royalty, it's just one of those management decisions that you wonder about sometimes. How involved are you in the book, still? Kurtz: Not very involved, there's nothing going on right now, that I know of. There was a lesser edition, there was another 5,000 copies that was printed on less good quality paper. Which is the only version I've been able to find, and I had to pay $150 for it. Kurtz: You never found one of the original covers, did you? No, number. Kurtz: Well, there aren't very many floating around. As I said, there were 5,000 numbered copies with a hand-signed Barks lithograph inside. I only know there were a few floating around on the market, and that's about it. They go for upwards of $5,000. Kurtz: Really? That much? Yes. Kurtz: Really? Well, I can believe it. Having dealt with the collector's market in a lot of different areas, especially with Star Wars stuff, it seems like anything that's scarce somehow becomes incredibly valuable. I don't know how they decide, but, you remember the Star Wars cookie jar? The little one, the little R2-D2 cookie jar? That was made by a small ceramics company that made a few things at the beginning of Star Wars. The company went out of business, and I think that they made 10,000 of those. I remember, I had ordered 500 of them myself, to give away as gifts, which I did, to family and friends at the time that Empire came out, because they were actually made after Star Wars came out. I did that, and I sent them all out and I saved about 20, I had in my storage facility. Then I forgot about them, and something like 15 years later I found a lot of stuff in storage when I was cleaning out that area and had people moving stuff to a smaller storage area, and I said I don't want to keep 20 of these, so we'll call up some of the collectors and see if anyone's interested in them. It turns out this $13 item is now worth $700. Ign. So you made a tidy profit? Kurtz: Yes. So all the merchandise stuff that I sold either went to my children's education or to various charities of one kind or another. I felt that was sort of worthy use of merchandising revenue. Ign. To say the least.